Somewhere in the world, right now, a king is at war with his own mother. It feels like a line from some forgotten dark fairy tale, but it is one of the oldest and most brutally consistent truths of history. The grand, sweeping arcs of nations often begin not with a thunderclap of ideals, but with the quiet, bitter grind of a family dispute. The birth of an empire, the drawing of a line on a map that will endure for 900 years, can hinge on a son's ambition and a mother's love for the wrong man. We like to imagine history as a grand stage, but so much of it is just a messy, all too human drama, played out with crowns and armies instead of slammed doors and angry text messages. It's in these quiet, personal moments that the tectonic plates of the world truly shift. And tonight, we're going to drift back to one of those moments, to the very beginning of a story that would eventually wrap itself around the entire globe. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always find it so calming to see where everyone is tuning in from. If you feel like it, drop your city or country and the local time in the comments below. It's a lovely reminder that we're all under the same sky, listening to the same old stories. Our story begins on the damp, rugged western fringe of a continent, a place that felt less like a center of anything and more like the very end of the known world. This sliver of land, clinging to the Atlantic, was not yet called Portugal, not in the way we understand it. It was Portugal, a county, a frontier territory, a kind of buffer zone in the centuries-long grinding push and pull known as the Reconquista. To the south, the sophisticated, fractured Muslim emirates of Al-Andalus. To the north and east, the ambitious and often squabbling Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile, and Aragon. Portugal was a vassal, a piece on a much larger chessboard belonging to the King of Leon and Castile. It was a land of granite hills, green river valleys, and hardy people who knew the taste of iron in their water and the constant threat of a raid from over the next hill. It was granted, as a reward for services rendered, to a French crusading knight, a younger son with no prospects back home, named Henry of Burgundy. He married Teresa, the illegitimate but clever daughter of the King of Leon, and together they ruled this frontier county, holding the line, dreaming of more. When Henry died, Teresa took the reins as regent for their young son, Afonso Henriques. And here, the story gets complicated, turning from a geopolitical struggle into a domestic drama. Teresa was a capable ruler, but she fell in love with a powerful nobleman from neighboring Galicia, a man named Fernão Pérez de Trava. To the powerful barons of Portugal, this looked like a disaster in the making. Their own hard-won autonomy, their identity, was being diluted, managed from afar by a Galician lord who saw their lands as just another piece of his personal portfolio. They watched as their regent, their countess, seemed to be drifting away, merging their destiny back into the orbit of their powerful neighbors. All their hopes and fears began to crystallize around the boy, Afonso Henriques. He was one of them. He was the son of Henry, the founder of their little dynasty. And he was growing up fast, watching his mother's political and romantic alliance with a quiet, simmering resentment. Was it the righteous anger of a patriot, seeing his homeland suborned? Or the simple jealousy of a young man seeing his inheritance and his mother's attention given to another? The truth, as always, is probably a murky blend of both. This is the great historiographic mystery at the heart of Portugal's birth. The official national story, the one cemented in statues and poems, is of a heroic young prince raising the banner of independence against a foreign-influenced tyrant who just happened to be his mother. But many historians see something different. They see a raw power struggle, a feudal civil war where the concept of Portugal as an independent nation didn't really exist yet. Afonso Henriques and his allied barons were fighting for their own power, their own land, and their own future, against another faction of nobles loyal to his mother. The idea of national liberation was a narrative conveniently crafted after the fact. The first battle for Portugal was not against a foreign king or a Moorish emir. It was son against mother. On a summer day in 1128, just outside the walls of the castle of Guimarães, the two forces met. It was likely a small, chaotic affair, not a grand battle of sweeping cavalry charges, but a desperate, brutal clash of armored men on a dusty field. It was the Battle of São Mamede. And when the dust settled, Afonso Henriques, still just a teenager, had won. He captured his own mother, and depending on the account, either imprisoned her for life or simply exiled her. He had secured his power base. He was the master of the county of Portugal, but being master of the county wasn't the same as being a king. For that, he needed two things: more land and recognition. So he turned his gaze south. For the next several decades, Afonso fought. He fought his cousin, the King of Leon and Castile, to a standstill, forcing him to acknowledge his autonomy. And he fought the Moors, pushing the frontier of his small territory relentlessly southward. This was the brutal, grinding work that forged a kingdom. It was a war of sieges, of scorched earth, of long marches under a punishing sun. In 1139, he won a legendary, almost mythical victory against a vastly superior Muslim army at the Battle of Ourique. The story goes that on the eve of the battle, he had a vision of Christ on the cross, promising him victory and a crown. Whether a true vision, a convenient dream, or a masterful piece of propaganda, it worked. His men, fired with religious zeal, proclaimed him their king right there on the battlefield. Rey Afonso, King Afonso, the Conqueror. He would spend the rest of his long life securing that title. In 1147, with the help of a motley fleet of English, Flemish, and German crusaders on their way to the Holy Land, he captured the great city of Lisbon after a grueling 4-month siege. With Lisbon, the strategic and spiritual heart of his new kingdom was secure. Finally, in 1179, after decades of diplomacy and warfare, the Pope in Rome officially recognized what Afonso had already made a reality. Papal bull, Manifestus Probatum, declared Portugal an independent kingdom, and Afonso its king, the sliver on the edge of Europe, born from a family feud and forged in the fires of the Reconquista, was now a nation looking out at the vast, intimidating, and empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, little knowing that its entire destiny lay waiting out there, just over the horizon. The new nation stood for a time with its back to Europe and its face to the sea, blinking in the Atlantic glare. 2 centuries passed in the slow rhythm of medieval life, a long exhale after the frantic birth of the kingdom. The borders solidified, the language found its unique cadence, and the last of the Moorish strongholds in the south, the Algarve, was finally taken, completing the map of Portugal as we know it today. The Reconquista was over, at least within their own territory. But the crusading spirit, that potent, volatile mixture of religious fervor and acquisitive greed, did not simply evaporate. It lingered in the air, a kind of potential energy looking for a direction. Portugal was a poor country, with thin soil and few natural resources. It had a long coastline, excellent harbors, and a population of fishermen and sailors who knew the moods of the sea as intimately as a farmer knows his fields. The nation was a coiled spring, and the man who would give it its decisive outward push was not a king, but a prince, a strange, reclusive, and utterly obsessed prince, who rarely, if ever, went to sea himself. His name was Enrique, the third son of King John I, a man we now know as Prince Henry the Navigator. He was a paradox, wrapped in the coarse, dark wool of a religious ascetic. He was the Grand Master of the Military Order of Christ, the wealthy and powerful successor to the Knights Templar in Portugal. He was famously pious, reportedly a lifelong virgin, a man who spent his days in quiet contemplation and prayer. Yet beneath that austere surface burned an ambition as vast and restless as the ocean. He stared at every day. He was a visionary, a data analyst, and a venture capitalist rolled into one. He understood that the future would not be won on the crowded battlefields of Europe, but out on the blank spaces of the map. He was not a navigator in the literal sense of steering a ship, but in the grander sense of steering a nation's destiny towards a single, all-consuming goal: unlocking the secrets of the Atlantic. The first great outward expression of this new energy came in 1415 with the conquest of Ceuta, a wealthy Muslim trading port on the North African side of the Strait of Gibraltar. Henry and his brothers led the charge, a chaotic and bloody affair that was a resounding success for Christian arms. They had their glorious crusade. But once the fervor of battle subsided and they took stock of their prize, a certain disappointment set in. They had captured the city, the terminus of the great trans-Saharan trade caravans, but they had not captured the trade itself. The caravans simply diverted to other ports. Ceuta, under Portuguese control, became a costly military garrison, a money pit bleeding the royal treasury dry. It taught Henry a crucial lesson. It wasn't enough to capture the end point of the trade network. You had to find a way to bypass it entirely. You had to go to the source. And the source of the gold, the spices, the ivory, and the rumored enslaved peoples was somewhere deep in the mysterious heart of Africa, a continent no European sailor had ever managed to circumnavigate. They were blocked by fear, by legend, and by a very real and dangerous technical problem: the winds and currents of the Atlantic. So Henry retreated. He established his court not in the bustling capital of Lisbon, but on the remotest, windiest, most desolate point of land in all of Portugal, the Sagres Peninsula, a rocky finger of land pointing defiantly into the wild expanse of the ocean. And it is here that we encounter the great historical debate surrounding him, the School of Sagres. For generations, this place was imagined as a formal institution, a kind of maritime university with lecture halls, an observatory, and bustling workshops. The world's first advanced research institute for exploration. It's a romantic, compelling image. But the quiet truth, unearthed by more recent historians, is that there is no solid evidence any such building or formal school ever existed. There are no ruins, no contemporary accounts describing a campus. The school was something more subtle, more modern, and perhaps even more effective. It was less a university and more of a think tank, a research and development hub. Henry, using the immense wealth of the Order of Christ, gathered around him not students, but the finest minds available. Grizzled sea captains, Jewish and Arab cartographers who could read the most advanced maps from the Mediterranean, Italian shipbuilders, German astronomers. They came to Sagres and worked, not in classrooms, but in quiet collaboration. Their task was to solve a series of interlocking puzzles. First, the maps. They collected every sea chart, every pilot's logbook, every snippet of sailors' gossip, and painstakingly collated the data, creating ever more accurate charts of the African coastline, correcting the fantastical errors of ancient geographers with hard-won empirical knowledge. Second, the ship. The lumbering, square-rigged cogs of the Mediterranean were useless in the unpredictable Atlantic. Under Henry's patronage, shipbuilders perfected a new kind of vessel, the caravel. It was small, light, and agile, with a shallow draft for exploring coastlines and lateen sails that allowed it to sail much closer to the wind. It was the spaceship of its day, a revolutionary piece of technology designed for one purpose: to probe the unknown. Finally, and most crucially, was the problem of the return journey. Sailing south along the African coast was relatively easy with the prevailing winds. But coming back was another story. For years, his ships would inch their way down the coast, only to be trapped, unable to make headway against the constant northeasterly winds on their return. The solution they discovered, the volta do mar, or turn of the sea, was profoundly counterintuitive. To get back to Portugal, ships had to sail far out to the west, away from land, into the open, terrifying ocean, until they caught the westerly winds that would blow them home. It required a supreme leap of faith and a total reliance on celestial navigation, on the stars, the sun, and the delicate instruments that measured them. For years, Henry sent out expeditions, one after another. Most of them failed, turning back at a fearsome-looking cape called Bojador, which sailors believed marked the edge of the world, a point of no return where the sea boiled and sea monsters dwelled. But Henry was relentless. He cajoled, he bribed, he commanded. Finally, in 1434, one of his captains, Gil Innes, pushed past the cape and found nothing, just more ocean, and a coastline that continued ever southward. The psychological barrier was broken. In the meantime, Henry's mariners had made other, less dramatic but profoundly important discoveries. They had stumbled upon and begun to colonize the uninhabited, fertile islands of the Atlantic. First Madeira, then the Azores. These islands became crucial staging posts for future voyages, and more ominously, they became giant open-air laboratories where the Portuguese pioneered a new economic model of cash crop plantation agriculture, growing vast quantities of sugar with imported slave labor, a grim and lucrative blueprint they would later export across the globe. The machine was being built, piece by painstaking piece, on that lonely, windswept cliff in Sagres, all driven by the quiet, monomaniacal obsession of a prince who was pointing his nation and the world toward a future he could only imagine. Passing the cape that sailors had once called the point of no return did not solve the problem of Africa. It simply revealed its true, staggering scale. It was one thing to nudge a few miles past a dreaded landmark, and quite another to chart an entire continent whose coastline seemed to unspool endlessly into the south. Each league forward presented a new set of challenges, not of sea monsters and boiling oceans, but of a far more practical and stubborn nature. The real demons were geometry, wind patterns, and the maddening curvature of the earth. Prince Henry's hub of experts at Sagres, that informal collection of the brightest minds, now faced its greatest task: building the hardware and writing the software that would allow their sailors to not just venture into the unknown, but to do so systematically, reliably, and most importantly, to come back with their data. The age of legend was ending, and the age of calculation was beginning. The key to unlocking the world, they realized, lay in two things: the design of the perfect ship and the ability to read the secrets hidden in the constellations. First came the vessel, the beautiful instrument of their ambition, the caravel. It was a masterpiece of necessity, born from the unique demands of Atlantic exploration. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been dominated by the galley, powered by oarsmen, and the portly square-rigged merchant cog, a ship designed to haul bulky cargo in predictable seas. Think of it as a reliable cargo van. But the Atlantic was a different beast entirely. Its winds were fickle, its swells were enormous, and its coastlines were unmapped and treacherous. The caravel was the answer. A vessel that felt more like a high-performance sports car in comparison. It was small, rarely more than 70 feet long, and astonishingly nimble. Its secret weapon was the triangular lateen sail, an innovation borrowed from the Arab dhows of the Indian Ocean. Unlike a square sail, which is excellent for running with the wind behind you, the lateen sail allowed a ship to cut into the wind, to zigzag against the prevailing breezes. This was the technological leap that made the Volta du Mar, that great westward sweep into the open ocean, a practical and repeatable maneuver rather than a suicidal gamble. The caravel also had a shallow draft, meaning its hull didn't go very deep into the water. This allowed its captains to duck into uncharted estuaries, to probe the mouths of mysterious rivers, and to skim over coastal reefs that would have torn the bottom out of a heavier ship. It was strong, yet light, fast, yet precise. It was the perfect tool, a scalpel for dissecting a continent. But even the most perfect ship is just a drifting piece of wood without a pilot who knows where he is. And as the caravels pushed further south, their pilots entered a state of profound navigational crisis. For all of history, Northern Hemisphere sailors had a constant comforting friend in the night sky: Polaris, the North Star. Because it sits almost directly over the North Pole, its height in the sky is a direct and simple indicator of your latitude, your distance from the equator. A pilot could measure the angle of Polaris above the horizon with a simple quadrant, and he would know, with reasonable accuracy, how far north or south he was. But as the Portuguese ships crossed the equator, their old friend betrayed them. Polaris sank below the northern horizon and vanished. They were sailing in a completely alien sky, with no fixed southern pole star to guide them. They were, for the first time in human history, truly lost in the heavens. The psychological impact must have been immense, a feeling of being untethered from the very cosmos. The solution came not from looking at the stars at night, but from staring into the blinding glare of the sun at midday. Henry's circle of astronomers, many of them Jewish scholars who had preserved and advanced the astronomical knowledge of the classical world, knew that latitude could also be calculated by measuring the maximum altitude of the sun as it crossed the meridian each day. But this was infinitely more complex than sighting Polaris. It required incredibly precise instruments, like the mariner's astrolabe, a heavy brass disc with a rotating sight that could be held steady on the pitching, rolling deck of a tiny ship. It required complex mathematical tables painstakingly calculated by hand to correct for the sun's seasonal declination. And it required a pilot with a steady hand, a sharp eye, and the nerve to perform complex calculations while the ship bucked and groaned around him. Men like the great Jewish astronomer Abraham Zacuto, working under royal patronage, compiled the essential tables, the almanacs that became the secret software of the enterprise. These were not mere books. They were the keys to the kingdom, allowing a pilot to turn a simple measurement of the sun's height into a precise coordinate on a chart. This knowledge was deemed so valuable that it became the subject of one of history's first great efforts in state-sponsored information control. This was the policy of sidulo, or secrecy. The new maps, the padrones, which were updated after every single voyage with new coastlines, rivers and bays, were not public property. They were guarded in Lisbon's India House under lock and key. The astronomical tables and the secrets of their use were taught only to a select guild of royal pilots. There's a great historical debate about how effective this policy truly was. Some imagine a vast conspiracy, with spies in every tavern and deliberately falsified maps being sold to the rival Castilians. A more likely truth is that it was a frantic and ultimately failing effort to protect a trade secret. Sailors talk, pilots get captured, cartographers can be bribed. But the intent was clear. Portugal knew it had a technological head start, a unique combination of ship design, navigational science, and hard-won coastal data, and it intended to guard that advantage with everything it had. For a few precious decades, a Portuguese pilot held in his head and in his sea chest a set of skills that were almost magical to the rest of Europe. He was a new kind of man, a techno-magician, a mariner who navigated not by instinct and familiar landmarks, but by decoding the abstract language of the sun and stars. The caravel was his body, the astrolabe his eye, and the astronomical tables were his mind. The machine was now complete. The coast of Africa and all the worlds that lay beyond it were finally ready to be unlocked, with the technological code of the South Atlantic finally cracked. The real work could begin. The decades that followed the passing of Cape Boyador were not a mad dash, but a slow, methodical, and often brutal grind. It was a multi-generational relay race, run by a succession of hardened sea captains, each one tasked with pushing the known world a few hundred miles further south. A man like Nuno Tristão or Diogo Calm would take his small fleet of caravels, provisioned for a year, and sail south, his pilot clutching the precious secret charts from the previous voyage. They would follow the coastline charted by their predecessor until it dissolved into a blank space on the parchment. Then they were on their own. They would inch along the unmapped coast, the leadsman constantly calling out the depth, the cartographer sketching every inlet and headland, the pilot squinting at the midday sun through his astrolabe when supplies ran low or the crew was on the verge of mutiny from fear and scurvy. They would turn back, performing that great arcing volta, do mar, to return to Lisbon with their prize. A few more degrees of latitude, a new chapter for the closely guarded master map. And at the furthest point of each major voyage, they performed a strange and powerful ritual. They would row ashore lugging a heavy pre-carved limestone pillar called a padrome. Taller than a man, topped with a cross, and emblazoned with the royal coat of arms of Portugal, these pillars were driven into the soil of a prominent cape or river mouth. On the surface, their purpose was simple and declarative, a staking of a claim. This land, unseen and unknown by any other European power, was now under the sovereignty of the Portuguese crown. It was a political act, a planting of the flag, but historians now suspect a second, more subtle and scientific purpose. In an era before the reliable longitude, a padrome was a fixed physical marker of a known latitude. A future pilot, struggling to find his position, could sail to that latitude, run along it towards the coast, and know with certainty that he would eventually find the familiar stone pillar erected by his predecessor. It was a safe point in the great, dangerous game of exploration. It was an anchor of certainty on a coastline of terrifying unknowns, a quiet testament to the methodical, almost bureaucratic nature of their enterprise. For years, the coastline they mapped was the vast, empty edge of the Sahara Desert. The encounters were few, the landscape a monotonous and intimidating panorama of sand and sea. But then, somewhere around modern-day Senegal, everything changed. The desert gave way to scrubland, then to woodland, and then, to the astonishment of the sun-scorched sailors, to lush, impossibly green jungle. They had crossed a great climatic boundary and had reached sub-Saharan Africa. The air grew thick and humid, smelling of unknown blossoms and damp earth. The nights were filled with a cacophony of unseen creatures. And the coast was no longer empty. It was populated by vibrant, complex and well-organized societies. The Portuguese were not discovering a new world. They were stumbling into a very old one that was new only to them. This encounter brought about a slow, momentous, and ultimately tragic shift in their mission. Prince Henry's initial motivation was a mixture of crusade and curiosity, with a primary focus on finding the source of the gold trade. The first interactions with the coastal peoples were often violent raids, clumsy attempts to capture locals to be brought back to Portugal as curiosities and sources of intelligence. But these raids were costly, often met with fierce and effective resistance, and yielded little profit. A darker, but far more lucrative alternative soon presented itself. The Portuguese learned that slavery was an existing institution in parts of Africa, and that a powerful market for enslaved people was run by trans-Saharan traders. They realized it was far more efficient to trade than to raid. In 1445, they established a permanent trading post, a feitoria, at Arguin Island. Here, they began a grim but systematic commerce. Portuguese ships would arrive laden with bolts of cloth, copper pots, brass manacles, horses and wheat, and trade them with local merchants for the goods they craved. Gold dust, ivory, malagueta pepper, and human beings. This was the small, insidious beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. It did not yet involve vast plantations, but it established the fatal precedent and the economic logic that would cause such unimaginable suffering for centuries to come. Prince Henry the Navigator died in 1460, staring out at his beloved ocean from his cliff at Sagres. He had not found a route to India, nor the mythical kingdom of Prester John, but the project he had started was now too powerful and too profitable to die with him. It had a momentum all its own. The crown, under the shrewd and unsentimental King John II, took direct control of the enterprise, viewing it not as a crusade, but as a massive commercial venture. He poured state resources into the voyages, pushing his captains ever further. Diogo Cão reached the mouth of the enormous Congo River and made contact with the sophisticated Kingdom of Congo, establishing a diplomatic relationship that would endure for centuries. But still, the continent stretched on. Finally, in 1487, the king gave the command to a tough, obscure knight of the royal household named Bartolomeu Dias. He was to sail south until he found the end of Africa or died trying. Dias pushed further than any man before him, but off the coast of modern-day Namibia, his little fleet was caught by a ferocious storm. For 13 days, they were driven blindly south into the cold, terrifying seas of the high latitudes. When the storm finally broke, Dias turned east, expecting to find the coast. He found nothing. With a growing sense of dread and excitement, he turned the tiller north, and then he saw it. Far in the distance, the faint line of mountains and a coastline. A coastline that was running unmistakably to the northeast. Without knowing it, blown by the storm, he had rounded the continent. The way was open. He had passed the bottom of the world. He allegedly named the rocky promontory the Cape of Storms, in memory of his terrifying ordeal. But when he returned to Lisbon with the incredible news, his king, a master of public relations, knew better. He crossed out the name and renamed it Cabo da Boa Esperança, the Cape of Good Hope, the Cape of Good Hope. The name itself was a masterpiece of propaganda, a promise whispered back in the gilded halls of Lisbon. But for the sailors who had to face it, it remained the Cape of Storms. For nearly a decade after Bartolomeu Dias returned with his earth-shattering news, no follow-up voyage was launched. This pause seems strange, an almost inexplicable loss of momentum after a century of relentless effort. But it was not a pause of inaction. It was a pause for breath, for planning, and for espionage. The new king, Manuel V, who inherited the project and styled himself the Fortunate, understood that the next step was not another exploration. It was an invasion. An economic invasion, to be sure, but an invasion nonetheless. He knew that the Indian Ocean was not an empty sea waiting to be discovered. It was the bustling center of a global economy that had existed for thousands of years. A complex web of trade routes dominated by sophisticated Arab, Persian, and Indian merchants. To simply sail into that world would be like a small-town merchant trying to open a stall in the middle of Wall Street. They needed intelligence. So, while new ships were being built, spies like Pero da Covilhã and Afonso de Paiva were dispatched overland, disguised as merchants, on a perilous journey through the Middle East. Their mission: to map the ports of East Africa and India, to understand the currents of trade, to identify who held power, and to learn the one crucial word that was the entire point of this century-long quest: spices. When the time finally came to select a commander for this grand climactic voyage, the choice was a surprise, and it remains a minor historical mystery. The honor did not go to the proven Bartolomeu Dias, the man who had actually found the way. Instead, the king chose a man named Vasco da Gama. He was a minor nobleman in his 30s, not a famed explorer, but a man with a reputation for something else entirely: a cold, ferocious, and unbending will. He was a fixer, a man you sent to get a difficult job done, with little concern for the niceties. The king, it seems, had absorbed the intelligence from his spies. He knew that breaking into the spice monopoly would not be a matter of polite negotiation. It would require threats, intimidation, and a willingness to use the terrifying new technology of ship-mounted cannons. He didn't just need a navigator. He needed a warrior, a diplomat with a spine of steel, and if necessary, a ruthless pirate. He chose Vasco da Gama not for his experience on the sea, but for the ice in his veins. In the summer of 1497, a fleet of 4 ships, 2 of them purpose-built, heavily armed carracks, naus, departed from the mouth of the Tagus River in Lisbon. This was the Apollo mission of its day, the culmination of all the data, all the sacrifice, and all the technological innovation of the past century. And Gama's first major decision proved the value of that accumulated knowledge. Instead of painstakingly hugging the African coast, as all his predecessors had done, he did something radical. After reaching the Cape Verde Islands, he swung his fleet far out into the open Atlantic, almost to the coast of the yet undiscovered Brazil. For over 3 months and 6,000 miles, they saw no land, a feat of open ocean sailing that was simply unprecedented. He was using the great looping wind system of the South Atlantic, the Volta do Mar, on a gigantic scale, to bypass the contrary currents of the African coast and aim directly for the Cape of Good Hope. It was a stunning display of navigational confidence, a grand testament to the secret science perfected in the Amazons of Lisbon. After a brutal and terrifying passage around the Cape, they began the slow crawl up the eastern coast of Africa. And here they entered another world. This was the Swahili coast, a string of wealthy, cosmopolitan, and deeply Islamic city-states like Mombasa and Malindi. This was the edge of the Indian Ocean's world system, and the Portuguese were met not with the awe of isolated tribes, but with the cool, suspicious appraisal of sophisticated merchants who saw them for what they were: rough, uncivilized intruders. Their encounters were fraught with misunderstanding, suspicion, and outright hostility. In Mombasa, the local sheikh tried to capture their ships. It became clear to Gama that they were dangerously out of their depth, culturally and diplomatically. Their salvation came in the port of Malindi, where they finally found a ruler willing to cooperate, partly out of a local rivalry with Mombasa. And it was here they acquired the final, indispensable key to their quest: a pilot. The identity of this man is shrouded in legend, sometimes identified as the great Arab navigator Ahmad ibn Majid, though this is heavily debated. What is certain is that they hired a master mariner, a Gujarati pilot who knew the rhythms of the Indian Ocean, as well as a Portuguese fisherman knew the Tagus. He looked at their crude wooden astrolabes and likely laughed, showing them his own far more sophisticated instruments. And he taught them the secret of the monsoons. With the steady, predictable monsoon wind at their backs, the crossing of the final ocean was almost anticlimactic. For 23 days, they sailed east, and on May 20th, 1498, they saw the green, hazy hills of the Malabar coast. They had made it. They dropped anchor off the coast of Calicut, one of the greatest spice markets in the world. The 80-year gamble had paid off, but the triumph of arrival quickly soured. When Gama and his men went ashore, their reception was disastrous. The local Hindu ruler, the Zamorin of Calicut, received them, but he and his courtiers were utterly unimpressed. The Portuguese had brought their finest trade goods: coarse woolen cloth, strings of coral beads, wash basins, and hats. To the fabulously wealthy Indian court, draped in fine silks and cottons and adorned with jewels, these items looked like the contents of a peddler's cheap trunk. They were laughed at. The powerful Arab merchant guilds, who controlled the spice trade in the city, immediately recognized the existential threat the Portuguese posed and worked to sabotage them at every turn, portraying them to the Zamorin as little more than common pirates. Vasco da Gama, the proud, hot-tempered commander, was humiliated. After weeks of tense, fruitless negotiation, punctuated by the seizure of hostages on both sides, Gama made a hasty retreat. He managed to load a small symbolic cargo of pepper, cinnamon, and ginger. But he left Calicut in a fury, bombarding the city from his ships as he departed. The long, horrific journey home, against the monsoon winds, would take most of a year, and the ravages of scurvy would kill more than half his remaining crew. When his two surviving ships limped back into Lisbon in 1499, they did not carry much wealth. But they carried something far more valuable: proof. The seaborne route to the Indies was real. The door was open, but Vasco da Gama's violent, humiliating experience in Calicut had taught the Portuguese a vital and brutal lesson. If they wanted the riches of the East, they would not be allowed to trade for them as equals. They would have to take them by force. The salt-caked, half-dead survivors who returned with Vasco da Gama brought back more than just a few chests of spices and proof of a route. They brought back a vital piece of intelligence that would define the next century. They confirmed that the rulers of the East were not interested in what Portugal had to sell, and that the established merchant networks would resist their intrusion with every tool of commercial and political sabotage they possessed. In the court of King Manuel, this news was not met with despair, but with a cold clarity of purpose. The dream of a peaceful partnership in the spice trade died in the moment it was born. A new plan was conceived, one based not on the merchant scale, but on the mouth of a cannon. If the riches of the Indies could not be won through trade, they would be taken by terror. Portugal would not join the Indian Ocean world. It would hold a sword to its throat until it yielded its wealth. The age of discovery was over. The age of conquest had begun. The very next fleet, dispatched in 1500, was a clear statement of this new intent. Led by an aristocrat named Pedro Alvarez Cabral, it was a grand armada of 13 heavily armed ships and over 1,000 fighting men. While this fleet is famously remembered for being blown far off course in the Atlantic and making the first official European landing on the coast of Brazil, a momentous accident we will return to. Its primary mission was India. When Cabral finally arrived in Calicut, the air was thick with the memory of Gama's humiliating departure. He tried to establish a trading post, a feitoria, but tensions quickly boiled over. A dispute led to a riot, and the Portuguese factor was killed. Cabral's response was swift, disproportionate, and designed to be a spectacle of violence. He unleashed a full-day naval bombardment, the likes of which the city had never seen. The thunder of his cannons echoed across the Malabar coast as stone buildings were shattered. The port was set ablaze, and the Zamorans' unprepared fleet of local ships was systematically sunk. It was an act of pure, calculated state terrorism. A message sent not just to Calicut, but to every port in the Indian Ocean. This is the price of resistance. From this brutal encounter, the fundamental Portuguese strategy for empire began to crystallize. This is where we touch upon a great historical debate. Was their success due to some inherent European technological supremacy, or was it the result of a revolutionary and ruthless strategic vision? The truth is a fusion of the two. Their ships, the carracks, were sturdier ocean-going vessels than the Arab dhows, and their bronze cannons were arguably the finest in the world. But this advantage was specific. On land, a small Portuguese force was no match for the vast armies of the Indian subcontinent. Their genius, born of necessity, was to not even try. They conceived of an empire that was not based on land, but on water. Their goal was mare clausum, a Latin phrase meaning closed sea. They intended to use their naval advantage to control the arteries of trade itself, to turn the entire Indian Ocean into a Portuguese lake. They would become the gatekeepers, the toll collectors, the maritime mafia for half the world. The primary instrument of this policy was as simple as it was brutal: the cartas. This was a naval passport, a license to trade, which the Portuguese governor would issue for a hefty fee to local merchant ships. Any vessel sailing the Indian Ocean, from the Swahili coast to the Spice Islands of Indonesia, was required to purchase one. A ship caught at sea by a Portuguese patrol without a valid cartas was subject to immediate punishment. Its cargo would be seized, its crew killed or impressed into service, and the ship itself scuttled or burned. It was a protection racket on an oceanic scale. The Portuguese placed their fleets at the key maritime choke points: the Gulf of Aden, the Strait of Hormuz, the Malacca Strait, and simply strangled the old trade routes, redirecting the flow of wealth into their own coffers. They were a tiny nation, 1 million people at most, trying to dominate a trade network that served hundreds of millions. They could only do it through the focused and terrifying application of naval violence. The personification of this new merciless policy was none other than Vasco da Gama himself, who returned to India in 1502 in command of his own war fleet. He was no longer an explorer probing the unknown. He was an avenger, an admiral tasked with breaking the will of anyone who dared to defy his king. It was on this voyage that he committed an act of such calculated cruelty that it became infamous, even in a brutal age. He intercepted a large, unarmed ship named the Miri, which was carrying hundreds of Muslim pilgrims, including wealthy merchants with their families, on their return journey from Mecca. Gama systematically looted the ship of its considerable valuables. The passengers offered him a fortune to ransom their lives, but Gama refused. He had the passengers locked in the hold, and then, ignoring the pleas of even some of his own captains, he ordered the ship to be set on fire. For days, the Portuguese watched as the burning vessel drifted, listening to the screams of the men, women, and children trapped within, sinking any who managed to jump overboard. This was not a random act of piracy. It was a psychopathic piece of political theater designed to etch the name of Vasco da Gama into the psyche of the Indian Ocean as a synonym for merciless terror. The message was absolute. We are not bound by your rules. We are not bound by any rules. The old world was gone. A new violent order had arrived on the tides, smelling of salt, gunpowder, and blood. The policy of terror, shock, and awe had successfully shattered the old commercial order of the Indian Ocean, but it had created nothing to replace it. It was a strategy of disruption, not of dominion. A reign of terror based on naval patrols was exhausting and unsustainable. It left the Portuguese spread thin, a handful of wolves trying to police an entire ocean. The empire was a concept, a threat, but it had no bones, no heart, no center. It needed an architect, a man who could take the violent chaos unleashed by Gama and Cabral and forge it into a permanent, functioning structure of power. That man was Afonso de Albuquerque, a stern, grey-bearded nobleman in his 50s, a man who possessed a potent and terrifying combination of strategic genius, messianic certainty, and absolute ruthlessness. Where his predecessors were hammers, smashing everything in their path, Albuquerque was a master geostrategist, a man who saw the Indian Ocean not as a series of targets, but as a single, integrated chessboard. He arrived in India and quickly grasped the central weakness of the Portuguese position. A floating empire, he reasoned, was no empire at all. To truly control the sea, you had to control the land that mattered, the critical ports, the maritime choke points through which all trade was forced to flow. His vision, which historians still debate for its sheer audacity and coherence, was to seize and fortify three key pillars that would allow Portugal to lock down the entire trade network from East Africa to the Far East. He would create a triangle of power, three fortified naval bases that would serve as the permanent headquarters for Portuguese fleets, giving them the ability to dominate the region's most vital sea lanes year-round. It was a plan of breathtaking ambition, and for 6 relentless years, from 1509 to 1515, he pursued it with a singular, ferocious energy, single-handedly building an empire with fire, steel, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. The first pillar was the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow mouth of the Persian Gulf, through which the ancient trade in silk, pearls, and horses flowed to and from Persia and the Ottoman lands. In 1507, even before becoming governor, Albuquerque led a small squadron of 6 ships to this nexus of global trade. With an army of just 400 men, he faced a powerful city-state protected by a fleet of hundreds of vessels and a large land army. In an act of supreme, almost suicidal audacity, he demanded the city's surrender and submission to the King of Portugal. When they refused, he unleashed a masterclass in naval violence, systematically burning their fleet and bombarding the city until the terrified ruler submitted. He had captured the first key, though he was forced to abandon it temporarily due to mutiny among his own captains. The legend of his ferocity was born, and he would return in 1515 to finish the job, building a massive fortress that would dominate the Gulf for over a century. The second and most important pillar was to be the capital of this new empire, the Estado da India, or State of India. For this, Albuquerque needed a central, defensible port on the Malabar coast. He bypassed powerful Calicut and set his sights on the island city of Goa. It had a magnificent deep-water harbor, perfect for sheltering fleets during the monsoon, and its political situation was unstable, making it a tempting target. In early 1510, with the help of a local Hindu corsair named Timoji, who saw the Portuguese as a useful ally against the city's Muslim rulers, Albuquerque seized Goa, but his hold was tenuous. A few months later, the powerful Sultan of Bijapur returned with a massive army and drove the Portuguese out. What followed was a grim, desperate siege at sea, with Albuquerque's fleet trapped in the river estuary for 3 months, his men starving and ravaged by disease. But Albuquerque's will was absolute. That November, with reinforcements, he returned. The reconquest of Goa was a brutal street-by-street battle that ended in a horrific act of policy to ensure the city would never again rise against him. And to send a message of terror throughout the region, Albuquerque ordered the systematic massacre of Goa's entire Muslim population. For 4 days, his soldiers killed thousands, men, women, and children. He then began the work of transformation, turning the blood-soaked city into the glittering capital of Portuguese Asia. He established a mint, built churches and hospitals, and controversially, encouraged his soldiers to marry the widows of the men they had slain, hoping to breed a loyal, local Christian population to garrison his new city. The third and final pillar of his grand strategy lay far to the east, the legendary city-state of Malacca, on the strait that bears its name. Malacca was the Singapore or Hong Kong of its day, the richest and most important commercial hub in all of Asia, a vibrant cosmopolitan metropolis where merchants from China, India, Arabia, and the Spice Islands all met to trade. It was the gateway to the source of the most precious spices, cloves, nutmeg, and mace, from the tiny Malaccan Islands. In 1511, Albuquerque arrived with his fleet. After a month-long brutal siege, his hardened veterans stormed the city, capturing the vital bridge over the river and turning the tide. The Sultan fled, and the greatest trading emporium in the world fell into Portuguese hands. With the capture of Hormuz, Goa, and Malacca, Albuquerque's strategic triangle was complete. In just 6 years, this one man driven by a will of iron had seized the 3 main arteries of the Asian maritime economy. He had built the skeleton of an empire that would endure for centuries. His end, however, was a bitter one. While returning from his final triumph at Hormuz, he learned that his political enemies in Lisbon, jealous of his power, had conspired against him. The king had appointed his chief rival to replace him. The news broke his heart. An old, sick, and disillusioned man, he died on his ship at the entrance to Goa's harbor, his eyes fixed on the city he had built. He left behind a simple, powerful legacy, the Estado da India, an empire of the sea, forged by his terrible, visionary genius. With the death of Afonso de Albuquerque, the heroic, chaotic age of conquest subsided into something more routine, more bureaucratic, and in many ways more challenging: the administration of an empire. The grand, bloody set-piece battles gave way to the slow, grinding work of maintaining control, collecting taxes, and ensuring the steady flow of spices back to Lisbon. Albuquerque had built the skeleton. It was up to his successors to put flesh on its bones and breathe life into the sprawling, improbable entity known as the Estado da India. This State of India was a new kind of empire, one that defies easy definition. A glance at a map from the mid-16th century would show a scattering of Portuguese flags dotted along the rim of the Indian Ocean, from Mozambique to the Moluccas. But this was an illusion. It was not an empire of territory, but an empire of nodes. It was a network, a string of fortified pearls draped across the arteries of Asian trade, and its lifeblood was the sea itself. The physical embodiment of this network was the fortress. Over 50 forts and fortified trading posts, or feitorias, were established, each one a stone and mortar testament to Portuguese power. A tiny European island planted in a vast and alien sea. They were marvels of military engineering, their low, thick, star-shaped bastions designed to deflect cannonballs, their parapets bristling with bronze artillery. Each was strategically placed to dominate a harbor, a river mouth, or a strait. From Sofala and Mozambique Island, they controlled the gold trade of East Africa. From Diu and Cochin, they managed the pepper trade of India's Malabar coast. From Colombo in Ceylon, they monopolized the world's cinnamon. Each fort served as a naval base, a warehouse, and an administrative center. It was a self-contained world, a microcosm of the empire. Inside its sweating stone walls lived the governor, a garrison of soldiers, a factor in charge of trade, a priest, and a handful of Portuguese officials and merchants, many of whom took local wives, creating a new Luso-Indian society that was loyal to the crown. Life in these outposts was a strange mixture of immense opportunity and profound misery. A soldier or a trader who survived his term could return to Portugal a wealthy man, his fortune made from the spice trade, or more often, from the vast ecosystem of corruption and private trade that flourished in the shadow of the official enterprise. But survival was far from guaranteed. The tropical humidity caused leather to rot, iron to rust, and gunpowder to spoil. The heat was suffocating, and diseases like malaria, dysentery, and typhoid fever were rampant, killing far more men than combat ever did. Beyond the walls was a world that was often hostile, and the garrisons lived under the constant threat of siege or sudden attack. It was an existence of long periods of crushing boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror, all set to the soundtrack of the lapping waves and the alien chatter of a foreign port. This entire far-flung network was held together by a single, vital, and incredibly perilous logistical thread: the Carrera de India, the India Run. Once a year, a fleet of lumbering, majestic carracks, the supertankers of their day, would depart from Lisbon, loaded with soldiers, silver bullion, and supplies. Their journey was one of the most grueling long-distance voyages in human history. They would sail south past the equator, swing west towards Brazil, then catch the winds that would sling them around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean, arriving in Goa 6 to 8 months after they started. The ships were horrifically overcrowded, floating petri dishes for disease. The food rotted, the water turned foul, and scurvy was an ever-present specter, its slow, agonizing progress dissolving the tissues of men's bodies. A storm off the Cape could swallow a ship whole, and the treacherous shoals of the Mozambique Channel wrecked dozens of vessels. It was not uncommon for a third of the men who left Lisbon to die before ever setting foot in Goa. Then, after a season of trading and refitting, the carracks would be loaded to the waterline with pepper, cloves, cinnamon, silk, and porcelain, and would begin the equally hazardous journey home. This yearly convoy was the empire's circulatory system. Its success meant fabulous wealth for the crown. Its failure, which happened all too often, meant ruin for investors and a weakening of the entire imperial structure. This unique structure has led historians to question whether it was a true empire at all. A better term might be a thalassocracy, a maritime empire, or what some have called a hollow empire. The Portuguese, with their tiny population, knew they could never conquer the vast land-based powers of Asia like the Mughal Empire in India or the Safavid dynasty in Persia. So they didn't try. They practiced a form of imperial minimalism. They controlled the sea lanes, the highways of commerce, but they owned almost none of the land where the goods were actually produced. They were, in essence, maritime parasites, attaching themselves to the host of the ancient and vibrant Asian economy, and using their naval power to divert its flow of riches into their own ships. This model was incredibly cost-effective. It allowed a small European nation to project immense power and extract staggering profits from halfway across the world. But it was also fundamentally brittle. The entire structure depended on maintaining absolute naval supremacy. The loss of a key fortress, or the arrival of a rival European navy with better ships and guns, could cause the whole delicate network to unravel. For a golden century, however, the system held. The forts were secure, the Carrera da India made its perilous journey, and the warehouse at Goa overflowed with the fragrant wealth of the East. With their grip on the Indian Ocean now consolidated, the more adventurous Portuguese captains began to look even further east, past Malacca, towards the mysterious, closed-off empires that lay beyond the horizon, the Celestial Empire of China and the Silver Islands of Japan. To understand the story of the Portuguese in Asia, one must understand the secret of Malacca. Long before the first European sails appeared on the horizon, this city, strategically nestled on the narrowest point of the strait that now bears its name, was not just a major port. It was the fulcrum of the entire global economy. It was the place where the world met. A Portuguese apothecary and chronicler, Tomé Pires, who knew the city well, put it best. Whoever is Lord of Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice. For centuries, this was the great meeting point, the nexus where the two halves of the civilized world, the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, exchanged their goods and ideas. Into its sweltering, bustling harbor sailed Arab dhows from the west, carrying woolen cloths from Europe and glassware from the Levant. They were met by the great towering junks from the north, dispatched by the Ming Emperor of China, laden with silks, porcelain, and tea. And from the east came the smaller, swifter prows of the Javanese and Malay sailors, carrying the most precious cargo of all, the cloves, nutmeg, and mace that grew only on a few tiny volcanic islands in the Banda Sea, the fabled Spice Islands. Malacca was the funnel through which all this unimaginable wealth flowed. The city itself was a cosmopolitan marvel, a testament to the power of commerce to create a vibrant, multicultural society. It was ruled by a Malay sultan, but its true power lay with the communities of international merchants who made it their home. The powerful Gujarati Muslims from India formed a kind of aristocracy of trade, controlling much of the westward flow of spices. Below them were the Javanese, the Chinese, the Bengalis, the Persians, each with their own quarter of the city, their own leaders, and their own role in the intricate dance of trade. It was said that over 80 different languages could be heard in the markets of Malacca. Its laws were designed to facilitate trade, its taxes were predictable, and its harbor was secure. This was the prize, the beating heart of the spice trade that the Portuguese had spent a century trying to reach, and their first attempt to engage with it was a catastrophic failure. In 1509, a small exploratory fleet under the command of Diogo Lopes de Sequeira arrived. They were welcomed at first as just another group of traders, but the Gujarati merchants, who had already felt the sting of Portuguese cannons in the Indian Ocean, recognized the existential threat. They knew the newcomers' true intentions. They conspired to convince the Sultan that the Portuguese were pirates and spies, and a trap was laid. A surprise attack was launched on the unsuspecting Europeans. Some were killed. The ships barely managed to escape, and a handful of men, including an officer named Rui de Araujo, were taken prisoner. The news of this treachery was the perfect pretext for Afonso de Albuquerque. 2 years later, in 1511, he appeared in the Strait of Malacca, not with a trading mission, but with the largest amphibious invasion force Asia had ever seen. 19 ships and some 1,200 fighting men, hardened veterans, fresh from the brutal conquest of Goa. He arrived with a dual purpose: to conquer the richest port in the world and to avenge the insult to his king by rescuing the captive Portuguese. The siege of Malacca became the supreme test of his strategic genius and his unbending will. He knew he was vastly outnumbered by the city's defenders, who commanded thousands of loyal Malay warriors and the support of the Gujarati merchant community. But Albuquerque held several advantages. He had his ship-mounted cannons, which he used to systematically bombard the city's waterfront defenses. He had the fanatic discipline of his veteran troops. And most importantly, he had a keen understanding of his enemy's internal divisions. This is the historiographic debate at the heart of the city's fall. Was it simply a matter of superior force? Or was it a masterpiece of psychological warfare and political manipulation? Albuquerque did not treat all the inhabitants of Malacca as a single enemy. He entered into secret negotiations with the leaders of the Chinese and Hindu merchant communities, rivals of the powerful Gujaratis. He promised them that if they remained neutral or actively supported him, their lives, property, and trading privileges would be protected under Portuguese rule. He presented himself not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a liberator from the corrupt influence of the Muslim Gujaratis. This masterstroke of diplomacy effectively split the city's defenses, ensuring that he would only have to fight the Sultan's most loyal troops. The decisive battle was for control of the Great Bridge that spanned the river, dividing the city into two halves. For more than a week, a brutal seesawing battle raged. The Sultan deployed his terrifying war elephants, clad in armor, hoping to break the Portuguese lines. But the disciplined European infantry held their ground with long pikes, and their matchlock muskets sowed confusion among the great beasts. Finally, during a high tide, Albuquerque landed a force from a tall junk he had commandeered, allowing his troops to attack the bridge from both ends at once. The position fell. The Sultan and his court fled into the jungle, and the wealthiest city in Asia was in Albuquerque's hands. The aftermath was typical of its conqueror, a mixture of calculated brutality and shrewd state-building. He granted his men the right to sack the homes and warehouses of the Malay and Gujarati merchants, an orgy of looting that yielded a staggering amount of plunder. But he kept his word to the Chinese and Hindu traders, placing their districts under his personal protection. And almost immediately, he began work on his own symbol of permanent dominion, a massive fortress he named Formosa, the famous one. In an act of profound symbolic desecration, he ordered his men to demolish the Sultan's grand mosque and the tombs of past kings, using the stones to build the walls of his new citadel. The message was clear. A new god and a new power were now in charge. The fall of Malacca was a cataclysm that sent shockwaves across the entire trading world. For the Portuguese, it was the crowning achievement of their imperial project. They now held the gateway to the Far East. From this new, powerful base, they could finally send their ships directly to the Moluccas to buy cloves at the source, cutting out every middleman. The throat of Venice was now firmly in Albuquerque's grasp. And beyond Malacca, new, even more mysterious horizons were opening up. The sea lanes leading to the vast, forbidden coast of China and the legendary Silver Islands of Japan. The conquest of Malacca had given the Portuguese the key to a door, and on the other side lay a labyrinth of new sea routes leading to lands that to the European mind were still draped in myth. From this new forward base, their ships began to probe further, driven by the lure of the Spice Islands. And it was on one of these chaotic, semi-legal ventures, a journey aboard a Chinese junk tossed about by a typhoon, that they were literally blown into a new world. In 1543, a handful of Portuguese adventurers washed ashore on the tiny Japanese island of Tanegashima. The encounter that followed was one of profound and mutual astonishment. The local Japanese looked upon these strange men, tall, hairy, with long noses and bizarre clothes, unable to communicate with any recognizable script, as something otherworldly. The Portuguese, for their part, found themselves in a land utterly unlike any they had yet encountered. This was not the sweltering, half-naked world of Africa or Brazil, nor the opulent, but, to their eyes, chaotic civilizations of India. This was Japan, a land of exquisite, disciplined beauty, and a warrior aristocracy whose code of honor and martial prowess commanded their immediate and grudging respect. The very first object that defined their relationship was not a crucifix or a bolt of silk, but a weapon. The Portuguese sailors were carrying matchlock muskets, or arquebuses, to the Lord of Tanegashima, a man embroiled in the constant, brutal warfare of Japan's Sengoku Jidai, or Warring States period. This loud, smoke-belching tube that could kill a man from 100 paces was not a curiosity. It was a revolution. He immediately purchased the 2 firearms from the foreigners for a princely sum and commanded his swordsmiths to reverse engineer them. The Japanese artisans, masters of metallurgy, not only replicated the complex screw mechanism and firing system with astonishing speed, but within a decade they had improved upon the design and were mass-producing firearms on a scale that dwarfed production in Europe. This single accidental encounter forever changed the nature of Japanese warfare and set the pattern for the century of contact that would follow. The Portuguese would be welcomed not as conquerors, but as purveyors of valuable and often destructive technology. A lucrative trade route quickly formed. The Portuguese, now operating from a new base in Macau, which we will visit later, became the essential middlemen in a fantastically profitable exchange. China, with its massive economy, had a huge demand for silver, but had officially banned direct trade with Japan, which it viewed as a nation of pirates. Japan, meanwhile, had recently discovered massive silver mines, but had an insatiable appetite for Chinese silk. The Portuguese stepped into this gap. Their great carrack, the Curufune or Black Ship, would make an annual voyage from Macau to the port of Nagasaki, laden with Chinese silk, which it would trade for a literal mountain of Japanese silver bullion. The profits from a single voyage could be astronomical, and for nearly a century, this trade formed the financial backbone of the entire Portuguese presence in the Far East. The Japanese called these strange newcomers the Namban, the southern barbarians, a term of mild condescension, but also of immense curiosity, and the art of this period is filled with fascinating depictions of the long-nosed foreigners and their great black ship. But the Black Ship did not just carry silk and silver. It also carried men with a different kind of ambition. In 1549, the Basque Jesuit priest Francis Xavier, one of the founders of the Jesuit order, arrived in Japan, determined to plant the seeds of Christianity in what he saw as a noble, if pagan, land. He and the missionaries who followed him quickly realized that the methods they used elsewhere would not work here. The Japanese were not an unlettered people to be easily awed. They were highly sophisticated, with ancient and deeply philosophical Buddhist and Shinto traditions. The Jesuits engaged in rigorous debate with Zen monks in their monasteries, and they understood that to succeed, they needed to win over the elite. This began the Christian century in Japan, and its initial success is a great historical mystery. Why did a significant portion of this proud and culturally self-assured nation embrace a strange, foreign religion? The answer is a complex tapestry of faith, creed, and politics. The Jesuits, particularly under the master strategist Alessandro Valignano, adopted a policy of cultural accommodation. They learned the Japanese language, adopted the local customs of dress and etiquette, and presented Christianity not as a replacement for Japanese culture, an idea they knew would be rejected, but as the fulfillment of its best qualities. But the more potent reason for their success was political. In the fractured landscape of the warring states, a local lord, a daimyo, was always looking for an edge over his rivals. To these men, the friendship of the Portuguese was a grand prize. It meant exclusive access to the firearms trade. It meant the profits from having the black ship use a port in their territory. And converting to Christianity, or at least showing great favor to the Jesuit fathers, was the surest way to secure that friendship. Several powerful daimyo in the south of Japan converted, and their samurai and peasant subjects often followed suit. The port city of Nagasaki grew from a sleepy fishing village into a major hub of international trade, and it was effectively gifted to the Jesuits to administer, becoming the Christian capital of Japan. For a few remarkable decades, a unique cultural fusion flourished. Japanese artists created beautiful screens depicting biblical scenes. Samurai wore rosaries over their armor. Western astronomy, medicine, and art trickled into Japan through this Jesuit-controlled window. By the end of the 16th century, there were an estimated 300,000 Japanese Christians, but the very success of the mission was also its greatest danger. As the chaos of the warring states began to subside, and powerful warlords like Toyotomi Hideyoshi began to unify the country, they looked upon this growing Christian community with deep suspicion. It was a religion that preached loyalty to a foreign potentate, the Pope in Rome, and its leaders were the gatekeepers to the foreign arms trade. To the new masters of a unified Japan, this looked less like a faith and more like the advance guard of a foreign invasion. The golden century of the Namban was living on borrowed time, while the accidental encounter with Japan opened up a new world of opportunity, the true grand prize of the Far East, the ultimate source of wealth and luxury in the European imagination, was China. But the celestial empire of the Ming dynasty was a challenge of a completely different order. This was not a collection of competing city-states like the Swahili coast, nor a fractured subcontinent like India, nor a nation embroiled in civil war like Japan. This was the most powerful, populous, and centralized state on earth, a monolithic bureaucracy governed by a deep and serene conviction of its own absolute cultural superiority. To the mandarins who ran the empire from the Forbidden City in Beijing, The rest of the world was a benighted fringe of tributary states and uncivilized barbarians. They did not need foreign trade. If foreigners wished to approach the Son of Heaven, they were expected to do so as humble supplicants, bringing tribute and performing the ritual kowtow. The Portuguese, accustomed to kicking down doors and dictating terms at the mouth of a cannon, were about to encounter a door made not of wood, but of a 4,000-year-old wall of bureaucratic indifference. Their first attempt at official contact was a spectacular disaster that poisoned relations for decades. In 1517, a fleet commanded by the diplomatic Fernão Pires de Andrade sailed to the city of Canton, modern Guangzhou, carrying an ambassador, the apothecary Tomé Pires. The initial contact was cautiously optimistic. Andrade behaved with impeccable diplomatic propriety, and the local officials were impressed enough to allow the embassy to travel overland to Beijing to be presented to the emperor. But while the slow process of Chinese bureaucracy was grinding along, Andrade's brutish and greedy brother, Simo, arrived on the coast with another fleet. He immediately began acting not as a diplomat, but as a conqueror in the mold of Albuquerque. He built an illegal fort on an island near the coast. He treated the local population with contempt, and worst of all, he began purchasing kidnapped Chinese children to sell as slaves. When news of these outrages, combined with reports of the violent conquest of Malacca, a state which was a formal tributary to the Ming Emperor, reached the court in Beijing, the official mood turned from cautious curiosity to righteous fury. The backlash was swift and absolute. The embassy of Tomé Pires was arrested as a gang of spies. Pires himself would die in a Chinese prison, his dream of a grand treaty in ruins. The Portuguese were officially branded as sea devils and pirates, and an imperial edict banned them from setting foot in China. For the next 30 years, the relationship was one of open hostility. Portuguese captains who tried to trade were met by imperial war junks. This period was the era of the smugglers and pirates, with renegade Portuguese adventurers carving out a precarious and violent existence in the coastal islands, trading illegally and occasionally raiding coastal towns. They had gone from being potential partners to being outlaws, a pest to be eradicated by the provincial navies. It seemed that the door to China was not just closed, but permanently bolted. But the lure of Chinese silk and porcelain was too strong to be abandoned. Slowly, patiently, the Portuguese began to change their tactics. They moved from confrontation to a strategy of pragmatic usefulness. They started unofficially collaborating with the very same Chinese coastal authorities who were supposed to be hunting them down, helping them to suppress the fleets of actual pirates, mostly Chinese and Japanese, who plagued the southern coast. They demonstrated, on a local level, that they could be a stabilizing force, a well-armed naval auxiliary that could help the local mandarins keep the peace. This bottom-up diplomacy, combined with the timeless power of well-placed bribes, began to slowly thaw relations, not at the imperial level in distant Beijing, but where it mattered, in the busy ports of the Pearl River Delta. The local officials, recognizing the immense potential for personal and provincial enrichment that controlled trade could bring, decided to find a way to let the Portuguese in without officially violating the imperial edict. The solution, arrived at around 1557, was a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity, and it gave birth to a unique city. The local mandarins granted the Portuguese merchants permission to establish a permanent base on a tiny, rocky, and sparsely populated peninsula at the mouth of the Pearl River. The place was called Amagao, the Bay of Ama, the sea goddess, a name the Portuguese would shorten to Macau. This is the great historical puzzle of Macau's origin. For the next 4 centuries, its legal status would remain a carefully constructed fiction, a diplomatic arrangement that allowed both sides to save face. To the Chinese emperor, Macau was, and always would be, Chinese soil. The foreigners were there on temporary sufferance, a special economic zone for troublesome barbarians, and they were required to pay an annual ground rent to the local magistrate as a clear sign of their subordinate status. To the Portuguese, however, Macau was a self-governing city, a permanent part of their overseas empire, where their own laws and their own captain major held sway. This agreement to disagree was the secret to Macau's survival. It was a conquest not of arms, but of subtle negotiation and mutual self-interest. On this tiny patch of land, a remarkable city began to grow. It became a singular blend of Europe and Asia, a place where the bells of a Baroque cathedral pealed within earshot of the gongs of a Taoist temple. Its narrow, winding streets, paved with cobblestones, brought as ballast in the great ships from Lisbon, were lined with Chinese workshops and the grand balconied houses of Portuguese merchants. Macau became the indispensable linchpin of Portugal's entire Far Eastern enterprise. It was the great warehouse where Chinese silks and Ming porcelain were gathered before being loaded onto the Black Ship for the immensely profitable voyage to the silver mines of Japan. It was the headquarters of the Jesuit mission to the entire region. It was a tiny, precious, and precarious window, a crack in the Great Wall of China through which the silver of the New World, funneled through Japan, flowed into China, and the luxuries of China flowed out to the rest of the world. It was an outpost that would outlast the entire rest of the Portuguese Asian Empire, a testament to the idea that, sometimes, the most enduring victories are won not with the sword, but with a patient, profitable, and cleverly worded lease. For all the blood, treasure, and ambition being poured into the great Asian enterprise, into Goa, Malacca, and the perilous trade with Japan and China, the Portuguese Empire was about to acquire a second, entirely different heart, not through a grand strategic design, but through a colossal accident. Or at least, that is the official story. We must cast our minds back for a moment, back to the year 1500, to the Grand Armada of Pedro Alvarez Cabral, the fleet we last saw delivering its brutal message of cannon fire to the city of Calicut. Before it reached India, that fleet was the protagonist in a strange and momentous detour, a B-plot in the grand imperial narrative that would, over the centuries, slowly grow in importance until it became the main story itself. The official mission was to follow up on Vasco da Gama's voyage and impose Portuguese will upon the spice trade. But to get to the Cape of Good Hope, Cabral, like Gama before him, executed the great westward sweep into the South Atlantic, the Volta do Mar. But he swung wider, far wider, so wide in fact, that after weeks of seeing nothing but the endless blue of the ocean, on an April afternoon, his lookouts spotted something impossible. A smudge of land on the western horizon where no land was supposed to be. This is where we encounter one of the great debates of the Age of Discovery. Was this landfall truly an accident, a simple navigational miscalculation on a much larger voyage, or was it a deliberate, secret, and brilliantly executed act of state policy. The Portuguese crown was notoriously secretive, as we've seen with its policy of sigilo. 6 years earlier, in 1494, Portugal and its great rival, Spain, had signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, an audacious agreement that drew a line down the middle of the Atlantic, dividing the entire undiscovered world between them. Everything to the east of the line would belong to Portugal, and everything to the west to Spain. It is entirely possible, many historians now believe, that Portuguese pilots already had secret knowledge of land on their side of the Tordesillas line, and that Cabral's mission included a secret directive to sail west, make an official landing, and formally claim this territory for the crown before continuing to India. His accident may have been the most carefully planned accident in history. Whatever the truth, the reality of the landing was one of wonder. The fleet anchored in a calm bay, and the Portuguese made their first cautious contact with the land's inhabitants, the Tupi people. The official record of this encounter, a long and lyrical letter written back to the king by the fleet's scribe, Pero Vaz de Caminha, paints a picture of paradise. He describes a land of infinite green, of sweet waters and endless forests, of brightly colored parrots, and of a people who seemed to be living in a state of primal innocence. The Tupi were healthy, handsome, and utterly without shame in their nakedness. They were fascinated by the iron tools of the Portuguese, but showed no interest in their gold or silver. Caminha's letter is filled with a sense of awe. This was not a land of wealthy cities to be conquered and plundered, like India. It was something else entirely, a Garden of Eden. Cabral claimed the land for his king, naming it the Ilha de Vera Cruz, the Island of the True Cross. After a week of peaceful interaction, he dispatched a single ship back to Lisbon to carry the news and Caminha's famous letter. And then the rest of the great fleet lifted anchor and continued on its primary bloody mission in the east. Back in Lisbon, the news was met with mild interest, but not great excitement. The initial reports confirmed what Cabral had seen. This new land was beautiful, vast, and apparently populated by gentle souls ripe for conversion to Christianity. But it had none of the things Portugal was looking for. There were no spices, no silks, and most disappointingly, no gold. For a crown that was beginning to taste the spectacular profits of the Asian spice trade, this new western land seemed like a pleasant but commercially irrelevant backwater. Its first, and for 3 decades its only, real value came from a single commodity, a type of tall, dense tree with a deep red heartwood, which produced a valuable crimson dye for Europe's booming textile industry. The wood was called pau-brasil, Brazil wood, and soon the land itself came to be known by the name of its only export, Terra do Brasil, the land of Brazil. For the next 30 years, the Portuguese crown treated Brazil with a policy of benign neglect. The focus was on the Estado da India. Why invest in a land of loggers when you could be the master of the world's spice trade? The king leased out the Brazilwood trade to a consortium of private merchants. Their model was simple and cheap. They did not build cities or plant fields. They established a few fortified trading posts, the familiar feitorias, along the coast. Their ships would arrive, and their agents would barter with the local Tupi tribes, trading cheap iron axes, knives, and trinkets for the Tupi's labor in cutting down the massive Brazilwood trees and hauling them to the coast. It was a purely extractive enterprise, a logging operation on a continental scale. But this low-cost, low-effort approach created a vacuum. French privateers, seeing an opportunity, began to sail to the Brazilian coast, setting up their own trading relationships with Tupi tribes, who were often hostile to the Portuguese. The French presence became a serious threat to Portugal's tenuous claim under the Treaty of Tordesillas. King John III realized that if he wanted to keep Brazil, he would have to occupy it. The era of neglect had to end. In 1534, he launched a grand and ambitious scheme to colonize this forgotten corner of his empire. He divided the entire coastline into 15 enormous strips of land called captaincies and granted them to wealthy proprietors, the donatarios, who were expected to finance the settlement and development of their territory out of their own pockets. It was a massive experiment in privatized colonization, a desperate gamble to populate a continent on the cheap. This was the true beginning of Brazil as a colony, a transformation born not of a lust for gold, but of the simple fear of losing the land to a rival. The accidental empire, long ignored, was about to demand the full attention of its masters. The grand experiment in privatized colonization, the system of hereditary captaincies, was, for the most part, a dismal failure. The vast, untamed coastline of Brazil proved too much for the ambitions of individual noblemen who lacked the immense capital and military power needed to tame the land and fend off hostile indigenous tribes. Most of the captaincies withered on the vine, becoming little more than lines on a map. But two of them, São Vicente in the south, and most spectacularly, Pernambuco in the northeast, not only survived but thrived, and they owed their success to a single, miraculous plant, a tall, thick-stemmed grass that had been slowly making its way across the world from its origins in New Guinea. It was sugarcane. These two successful captains had invested their fortunes not in the Brazilwood trade, which was a business of extraction, but in the complex and costly business of cultivation. They had discovered Brazil's true vocation, the commodity that would define it for the next 2 centuries. Sugar. Recognizing both the failure of the old system and the immense potential of this white gold, the Portuguese crown finally decided to take Brazil seriously. In 1549, King John III revoked the powers of most of the private captains and established a centralized royal government. He dispatched a governor-general, a seasoned soldier named Tomé de Souza, with a fleet of ships, soldiers, artisans, and Jesuit priests. Their mission was to build a capital city, a seat of power that would anchor the Portuguese presence and project royal authority over the vast territory. On a high bluff overlooking a magnificent bay, they founded the city of Salvador da Bahia. This act marked the true beginning of colonial Brazil. The age of neglect was over. The age of the sugar engine had begun. The Portuguese had a century of experience cultivating sugar on their Atlantic islands, Madeira, the Azores, and São Tomé. And they knew it was a product with an almost insatiable demand in Europe, where it was still a costly luxury, a status symbol for the rich. They also recognized that the long, fertile coastal plain of northeastern Brazil, the Zona da Mata, with its rich red soil and abundant rainfall, was perhaps the most perfect place on earth to grow it. The economic and social life of the colony soon came to revolve around a single, powerful institution, the Engenho. The word literally means engine, and while it specifically referred to the heavy grinding mill that crushed the juice from the sugarcane, It came to represent the entire sugar plantation complex. The Ingenio was a self-contained hierarchical world, an agro-industrial factory set down in the middle of the wilderness. At its heart was the mill, powered first by oxen or water, its great rollers groaning day and night during the harvest season. Next to it stood the boiling house, a vision of hell, where the cane juice was heated in a series of huge copper kettles, the air thick with a cloying sweet steam and the constant danger of horrific burns. At the top of this world stood the manor house, the Casa Grande, the home of the planter, the Señor de Ingenio, a man who ruled his domain like a feudal king. And at the bottom, in the crowded, squalid barracks known as the Senzala, were the hundreds of human beings whose forced labor made the entire engine run. Initially, the Portuguese tried to power this engine with the bodies of the local inhabitants. The Jesuits established missions to pacify and convert the Tupi, hoping to turn them into a docile workforce. More often, the planters organized brutal slave-raiding expeditions called banderas that pushed deep into the interior, burning villages and dragging captives back to the coast. But as a labor source, the indigenous peoples proved to be a tragic failure. They were not accustomed to the relentless, back-breaking monotony of agricultural labor. They knew the land intimately and could escape into the vast interior with relative ease. And most devastatingly, they had no immunity to European diseases. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through the native population like a firestorm, killing millions in one of the great demographic catastrophes of human history. With the indigenous population collapsing, the planters turned their eyes across the Atlantic to Africa. Here was the solution to their labor problem, a solution built on a foundation of staggering cruelty. The Portuguese already controlled a string of trading forts along the African coast, from Elmina to Luanda. They had a well-established trade in gold, ivory, and pepper, and a smaller but growing trade in human beings. Now, the voracious, insatiable appetite of the Brazilian sugar engine would cause that human trade to explode in scale. The grim logic of the planters was simple and brutal. Enslaved Africans, unlike the Tupi, had immunities to old-world diseases. Many came from agricultural societies and had the skills the planters needed. And crucially, they were thousands of miles from their homes, isolated, disoriented, and with nowhere to run. They were the ideal captive workforce. This brings us to a somber historical question. Why was the system of slavery that developed on the Brazilian sugar plantations so uniquely lethal? The answer seems to lie in the nature of sugar itself. Sugarcane cannot wait. Once it is cut, it begins to rot within 24 hours, its precious sucrose content degrading rapidly. This demanded a frantic, non-stop production schedule during the harvest season. The work was organized in a brutal, factory-like rhythm that never ceased. Field hands worked from sunup to sundown under the tropical sun, cutting the thick, heavy cane with machetes. Then the mill would run 24 hours a day, the night shift lit by torches, the air filled with the constant grinding noise of the machinery. The work in the boiling houses was even more dangerous, a skilled but hellish job involving the management of searingly hot liquids. The mortality rate was horrific. The life expectancy for an enslaved person on a sugar plantation was often less than 10 years. It was, from a purely economic perspective, cheaper for a planter to work an enslaved person to death over a few years and then simply buy a new one fresh off the ship from Africa than it was to provide the food, clothing, and care necessary to allow them to live longer and raise families. The sugar engine did not just run on labor, it ran on the constant, systematic consumption of human lives, creating a society of grotesque inequality, a land of sweetness and profit built upon a foundation of unimaginable bitterness and pain. The sugar engine, once started, was a machine that could never be satisfied. Its fuel was human life, and its demand was ceaseless. To feed this machine, the Portuguese Empire reconfigured itself, turning its South Atlantic possessions into a vast, terrifyingly efficient system for the capture, transportation, and consumption of human beings. The trade in enslaved Africans was not merely a component of the Brazilian sugar economy. It became its very foundation, a monstrous and lucrative enterprise that was the dark heart of the entire Atlantic Empire for 300 years. This system operated on a grimly logical business model, a direct shuttle of human cargo that dwarfed the more famous triangular trade of the North Atlantic powers. Ships known as tumberos, a chilling name that translates to floating tombs, would depart from the great Brazilian ports of Salvador and Recife. They were not laden with gold or spices, but with lower value goods produced in Brazil itself. Rough textiles, barrels of fiery sugarcane brandy called cachaça, and rolls of tobacco, which had become a highly sought-after commodity in West Africa. These ships sailed east to the great slaving ports controlled by the Portuguese on the African coast, primarily Luanda in Angola, and the forts of the gold and slave coasts. There, their cargo would be bartered for the only commodity that truly mattered: people. And here we must pause and confront a complex and agonizing historical truth. The old simple narrative of European marauders charging into the African interior with nets and chains is largely a myth. The Portuguese, like other Europeans, were confined almost exclusively to their coastal forts, vulnerable to tropical diseases and the power of well-organized African kingdoms. They did not have the manpower or the military capability to conduct slave raids themselves. The actual act of capture, the brutal work of warfare, kidnapping, and marching people to the coast, was carried out by Africans themselves. This in no way absolves the Portuguese of their primary monstrous guilt. It was their insatiable demand, their endless supply of trade goods, and particularly their introduction of firearms that created the infernal logic that drove the trade. A coastal king or a rising warlord needed guns to defend his state from his rivals. The only thing of value he had to trade for those guns was people. This sparked a horrific arms race, a self-perpetuating cycle of violence where kingdoms were forced to either prey upon their neighbors or be preyed upon themselves. The Portuguese did not create African slavery, which had existed in various forms for centuries, but they grotesquely magnified its scale and transformed it from a byproduct of warfare into the very reason for it, destabilizing entire societies and turning neighbor against neighbor in a desperate scramble for survival and power. Once purchased by the Portuguese traders on the coast, the captives began the most infamous chapter of their journey, the travessia, the Middle Passage. After being branded with the hot iron of their new owner, they were ferried in canoes out to the waiting tumberos. There, they were forced below decks into a scene of unimaginable horror. The goal of the ship's captain was to maximize his cargo, to pack as many bodies into the hold as physically possible. Men, women, and children were chained together, forced to lie shoulder to shoulder on rough wooden shelves, often with less than 3 feet of vertical space. They were trapped in near total darkness, lying in their own filth, the air so thick with the stench of sweat, excrement, and death that it was barely breathable. Disease, particularly dysentery, the bloody flux, and smallpox, ran rampant in these perfect incubators. The food was meager, the water often brackish. The human cost was staggering. On an average voyage, which could last from 1 to 2 months, 15 to 20% of the captives would die. Their bodies would be unchained from their living shipmates and simply tossed into the ocean. It was a journey of profound trauma and despair, a machine designed to strip a person of their name, their family, their humanity, and convert them into a unit of merchandise. Those who survived the crossing faced their final degradation. Upon arrival in Salvador or Recife, the human cargo, emaciated and traumatized, would be brought ashore to be reconditioned. They were fed and cleaned, their skin oiled to hide the sores and scars from the journey, all to make them more presentable for the auction block. They were then paraded through the city to the slave market, the mercado, where they were prodded, inspected, and sold like livestock. Planters and their agents would examine their teeth and limbs, buying them individually or in lots, with little regard for the family or kinship ties that had managed to survive the horrors of the crossing. From the market, they faced another long journey on foot to the sugar plantation in the interior, the final destination in their forced odyssey. The scale of this Portuguese-led tragedy is difficult to comprehend. Of the estimated 5 million Africans forced into the transatlantic slave trade, ships flying the Portuguese or Brazilian flag carried nearly 5 million, more than 40% of the total. This was by far the largest forced migration in human history, and it had a devastating impact on both continents. It bled West and Central Africa of generations of its strongest and youngest people. And it irrevocably shaped Brazil, creating a new Luso-African society, where by the end of the sugar era, the majority of the population was of African descent. The great fortunes of the Portuguese Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries were not built on the fragrant spices of the East, but on the bitter harvest of the sugar fields and the black sails of the ships that fed them their human fuel. While the great engines of empire ground on, one in the East processing spices, the other in the West processing sugar and lives, a strange and febrile drama was unfolding back in the heart of it all, in Lisbon. An empire, after all, is not just a network of trade routes and fortresses. It is a story a nation tells itself. And in the late 16th century, at the very peak of its fabulous wealth, that story was about to take a dark, irrational, and mythical turn. The imperial crown rested upon the head of a young man, Dom Sebastião, King Sebastian. He was the product of generations of royal inbreeding, a pale, zealous, and deeply troubled boy who had ascended to the throne as a child. He grew into a man utterly consumed by a single ruinous obsession, a fantasy of medieval chivalry and crusading glory that was dangerously out of step with the pragmatic, commercial age he was supposed to be leading. He was uninterested in the balance sheets from Goa or the price of sugar in Antwerp. His gaze was fixed south, across the strait, on the shores of Morocco. He dreamed of a great and glorious holy war, a chance to etch his own name alongside the great conquerors of his dynasty. His counselors, the seasoned men who managed the vast and complex machinery of the global empire, begged him to reconsider. A crusade in North Africa was a strategic folly, a pointless drain on a treasury already stretched thin by its global commitments. But Sebastian was a messianic figure in his own mind, chaste, pious, and convinced of his divine destiny. He would not be swayed. He emptied the state's coffers, raised taxes, and assembled the largest Portuguese army in a century. A magnificent but largely inexperienced force that comprised the flower of the nation's nobility. Every great house sent its sons, eager to win glory in the service of their romantic, God-touched king. Their pretext for invasion was a dynastic dispute within Morocco. Their true purpose was the fulfillment of Sebastian's chivalric dream. In the summer of 1578, this glittering army landed in North Africa and began a long, grueling march into the arid, sun-scorched interior, away from the safety of their fleet. On the 4th of August, on a wide, dusty plain near the town of Albuquerque, Sebastian's army met the vastly superior force of the Moroccan Sultan. The battle that followed, known in Portuguese history as the disaster of Albuquerque, was an unmitigated catastrophe. The Portuguese were exhausted, desperately thirsty, and tactically outmaneuvered from the start. The Moroccan cavalry enveloped their flanks, and their cannons tore through the dense squares of European infantry. The battle devolved into a chaotic, desperate slaughter under the blistering African sun. By the end of the day, the Portuguese army had ceased to exist. Thousands were killed, thousands more were captured to be sold into slavery, and almost the entire nobility of Portugal was either dead or in chains, awaiting ruinous ransoms. The day became known as the Battle of the Three Kings, for in its carnage, 3 monarchs perished: the ruling Moroccan Sultan, the rival he had deposed, and whom Sebastian was there to support, and the young, reckless king of Portugal himself. And this is where history dissolves into myth. King Sebastian was last seen charging headlong into the thickest of the fighting, a vision of doomed and glorious courage. He was cut down, but his body was never definitively recovered. In the chaos and carnage of the battle, he simply vanished. The lack of a corpse, of a single verifiable royal relic, created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed a tide of rumor, denial, and desperate hope. A nation, having lost its army, its nobility, and its king in a single afternoon, simply refused to accept the finality of it all. Surely God would not have allowed such a disaster. The king was not dead, people began to whisper. He was merely hidden, o encoberto, spirited away from the battlefield by angels. He was recuperating on some mythical island, perhaps the Isle of Avalon, like a new King Arthur, waiting for the precise moment to return and lead his people to their destiny. This national trauma was compounded by the immediate political crisis it created. Sebastian, the Virgin King, had died without an heir. The royal line of Aviz, the dynasty that had overseen the entire age of discovery, was extinguished. The closest and most powerful claimant to the empty throne was the king's uncle, Philip II of Spain. 2 years after the disaster, in 1580, Philip marched his armies into Portugal and claimed the crown, uniting the 2 Iberian kingdoms and their vast global empires. For Portugal, this was the ultimate humiliation, a loss of the independence they had cherished for 4 centuries. It was in the shadow of this occupation that the whispers about the lost king coalesced into a full-blown messianic cult, Sebastianism. It was a potent mixture of grief, magical thinking, and political resistance. To believe in the return of Sebastian was to reject the legitimacy of Spanish rule. The myth promised that on a foggy morning, the hidden king would reappear at the port of Lisbon, a mystical warrior savior who would cast out the Spanish and inaugurate the Fifth Empire, a prophesied golden age of universal Portuguese spiritual and temporal rule. The cult became so powerful that it spawned a series of tragic and bizarre impostors. Over the next 2 decades, 4 different men, from a low-born potter's son to an Italian adventurer, would appear across Europe, each claiming to be the returned Sebastian, each gathering a following of desperate believers before being unmasked and inevitably executed. But the exposure of these false Sebastians did nothing to dampen the true faith. For the believers, it was just another test. The real king was still out there, waiting. This strange spectral hope would become a deep and enduring part of the Portuguese soul, a dream of a lost golden age and a future redemption that would haunt the nation's poetry, its politics, and its sense of self for the next 300 years. The empire, at its material peak, had lost its psychological anchor and chosen to tether itself to a ghost. The ghost of the lost king, Sebastian, would haunt the dreams of Portugal. But the reality that followed his demise was a cold, hard, and pragmatic affair. With the royal line of Aves extinguished in the dust of Morocco, the empty throne of Lisbon became the object of intense geopolitical calculation. The most powerful and legitimate claimant was King Philip II of Spain, a monarch whose vast domains already stretched from Madrid to Mexico to Manila. He was Sebastian's uncle, a stern, workaholic ruler at the absolute center of a global web of power. In 1580, brushing aside weaker claimants, he enforced his inheritance with the decisive argument of an army. And the Spanish Habsburgs added the crown of Portugal and its sprawling overseas empire to their collection. For the first time, the entire Iberian Peninsula, and with it, the 2 largest global empires the world had ever known, were united under a single monarch. To the rest of the world, it looked like the creation of an unassailable superpower. But for Portugal, it was the beginning of a 60-year period that would later be remembered in the nation's history as the Babylonian captivity. This later narrative of a heroic Portugal held captive by its tyrannical Spanish rival is a powerful one, but the initial reality was more complex. Philip II was a shrewd politician. He understood that ruling his new kingdom required a lighter touch. At a grand assembly in the Portuguese city of Tomar in 1581, he swore a solemn oath to preserve the autonomy of Portugal. This was not to be a merger of nations, but a personal union of crowns. Portugal would remain a separate kingdom, with its own laws, its own language, its own currency, and its own councils of state. Most importantly, it would retain exclusive control over its own empire. The spice trade would still be run from the Casa da India in Lisbon, not from Seville. The viceroy in Goa and the governor in Brazil would still be Portuguese and would report to a Portuguese council, not to the Spanish court in Madrid. On the surface, for the average merchant or colonial official, life went on much as it had before. The only difference was the face on the coins. But this carefully constructed illusion of autonomy could not withstand the harsh realities of 17th century geopolitics. In uniting itself with Spain, Portugal had unwittingly entered into a fatal embrace. It had married into the powerful and deeply troubled Habsburg family, and in doing so, it had inherited all of their powerful and determined enemies. For a century, Portugal had maintained its empire through a delicate balancing act. It had a centuries-old and deeply practical alliance with England. It had a profitable, if unofficial, commercial relationship with the merchants of the Netherlands, who were the primary distributors and financiers of the spice trade throughout Northern Europe. But Spain was at war with both. Philip II was the great champion of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, locked in a life-or-death struggle with Protestant England and facing a seemingly endless, ruinously expensive rebellion from his Protestant Dutch subjects in the 80 Years' War. Overnight, Portugal's friends became its enemies. English privateers and Dutch captains, who had once docked peacefully in Lisbon, were now the enemy, and the entire, sprawling and thinly defended Portuguese empire was now a legitimate target. The most immediate and dangerous new enemy was the Dutch. Barred by Spanish embargoes from the markets of Lisbon, the brilliant and ruthless merchants of Amsterdam decided on a simple, audacious new strategy. If they could no longer buy the spices, they would go to the source and take them. In 1602, they created a revolutionary instrument to do just that. The Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. This was not just a trading company. It was a proto-state, a multinational corporation with its own armies, its own navy, and the power to wage war and sign treaties. The VOC was better financed, its ships were newer and more heavily armed, and its directors were unburdened by the crusading ideals that still clung to the Portuguese enterprise. Their motives were purely commercial, and they pursued them with a cold Protestant efficiency. They launched a systematic, well-funded, and relentless war on the Portuguese Estado da India. One by one, the fortresses that made up Portugal's hollow empire began to fall. The Dutch strategy was to bypass the heavily defended centers like Goa and instead seize the sources of production. They captured Ambon and Tidore, the heart of the clove-producing spice highlands, establishing a brutal and total monopoly. They blockaded Malacca for years, slowly strangling it until the great gateway to the Far East finally fell in 1641. They seized Ceylon with its priceless cinnamon trade. They even established a trading post in Japan, pushing the Portuguese out of their most profitable market. The Portuguese, scattered and poorly reinforced by a Spanish king whose priorities lay on the battlefields of Flanders, could only fight a desperate, losing rearguard action. Their century-old Asian empire, built by the visionary violence of Albuquerque, was being systematically dismantled, piece by painful piece. Nor was the onslaught confined to the east. In 1621, the Dutch created the West India Company, with its sights set on the single richest jewel in the Portuguese crown, the sugar coast of Brazil. In 1630, a Dutch fleet captured Recife and Olinda, the heart of the Pernambuco sugar captaincy. For over 2 decades, the Dutch would control the richest part of Brazil, a humiliation and an economic catastrophe for Portugal. The union with Spain had become a poisoned chalice. Captive in its own home, Portugal was being forced to watch as its children were devoured by the enemies of its new master. The simmering resentment was slowly beginning to boil. The union with the Spanish crown had placed a target on the back of the Portuguese empire, and the arrow that flew truest and struck deepest came from the cold, damp, and ferociously ambitious cities of the Netherlands. The conflict that erupted between these two nations in the 17th century was more than just another colonial war. It was a clash of two worlds, a struggle between two fundamentally different models of empire. It was a battle between the past and the future. On one side was the Estado da India, a century-old enterprise of the crown, a sprawling, leaky, and majestic structure held together by a mixture of religious zeal, noble honor, and bureaucratic inertia. On the other side was its nemesis, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, a revolutionary new kind of predator, a publicly traded corporation, streamlined, unburdened by religious imperatives, and lethally focused on a single, sacred goal: profit for its shareholders. It was a conflict not so much between two countries as between a medieval crusade and a modern corporation. And the corporation was destined to win. The success of the Dutch was not a mystery. It was a matter of design. This is the great historical lesson of their triumph. While the Portuguese king was often struggling to finance his fleets from the royal treasury, the VOC could raise immense sums of capital almost overnight on the new Amsterdam Stock Exchange. It could absorb losses that would bankrupt a monarch and build bigger, more modern fleets than its rival. Their shipbuilding was a marvel of efficiency. They perfected the Floyd, a type of cargo ship with a pear-shaped hull that was cheap to build, required a smaller crew, and could carry twice the cargo of a Portuguese carrack. It was less a warship and more a floating warehouse, a perfect instrument for a commercial empire. The entire Dutch enterprise was leaner, faster, and more adaptable, while Portuguese fortresses were often commanded by nobles whose primary qualification was their lineage. The VOC's outposts were run by ruthless merchants and accountants, men who answered to a board of directors in Amsterdam and whose performance was judged on the quarterly returns. Armed with these advantages, the Dutch executed a brilliant and brutal corporate takeover of the Asian spice trade. Their strategy was far more radical than that of the Portuguese a century earlier. The Portuguese had sought to control the trade of spices, taxing and channeling the existing flow of goods through their fortified ports. The Dutch sought to control the production of spices. They went to the source and seized it with a terrifying single-mindedness. Their most infamous act was the conquest of the Banda Islands in modern-day Indonesia, the only place on earth where the precious nutmeg and mace grew. After seizing the islands from a weak Portuguese grip, the VOC systematically exterminated or enslaved almost the entire native population, some 15,000 people, and replaced them with Dutch planters who operated vast nutmeg plantations using imported slave labor. This was an act of calculated genocide in the pursuit of a perfect monopoly, a level of cold, rational cruelty that gave even the most hardened Portuguese veterans pause. With the Banda Islands secured, the VOC became the sole supplier of nutmeg to the world, and they could set the price to whatever they wished. From this base, they began to methodically dismantle the rest of the Portuguese network, targeting its most vital arteries. The ultimate prize, the linchpin of the entire Portuguese system in the Far East, was Malacca. For decades, Dutch fleets blockaded the great city, slowly strangling its trade and weakening its defenses. Finally, in 1641, after a grueling 6-month siege, the Dutch breached the walls of the great fortress are Formosa, the masterpiece of Albuquerque, and the city fell. The loss of Malacca was a devastating blow, both strategically and psychologically. It cut the Estado da India in half, severing the link between Goa and the Far East. The Dutch then turned their attention to Ceylon, the island of cinnamon. For years, they waged a patient war, allying themselves with the inland kingdom of Kandy against the Portuguese. One by one, the Portuguese forts on the island fell, culminating in the capture of their last stronghold at Colombo in 1656. The world's cinnamon trade now belonged to the VOC, even on the Malabar coast of India, the very heartland of Portuguese power. The Dutch pressed their advantage. Their fleets blockaded Goa, the magnificent capital, pinning the Portuguese navy in its harbor. They then sailed down the coast, capturing Portuguese forts in Cochin and Quilon, seizing control of the pepper trade at its source. By the 1660s, the route was complete. The great seaborne empire of Albuquerque was a hollowed-out shell. The Portuguese had been almost entirely ejected from Indonesia, Malaysia, Ceylon, and Japan. Their once mighty chain of fortresses was reduced to a handful of possessions: the viceregal capital of Goa, the port of Diu in India, a few bases in East Africa, and the precarious trade-based foothold of Macau. The relentless, well-funded, and brutally efficient Dutch thorn had not just pricked the empire, it had surgically dissected it, cutting out its most profitable organs and leaving behind a ghost of its former glory. This catastrophic loss in the East would have a profound effect on the empire as a whole, with the fabled riches of the spice trade now largely in the hands of their rivals. The Portuguese were forced to turn their gaze ever more intently towards their one remaining asset, the vast and promising land that for a century had been a sideshow, but was now becoming their last best hope: Brazil. For 60 years, the Kingdom of Portugal had been a nation without a king of its own, a junior partner in the vast, unwieldy, and increasingly dysfunctional enterprise of the Spanish Habsburgs. The national pride, once so brilliant, had been dulled by the relentless loss of its imperial possessions and the bitter humiliation of being governed from Madrid. The messianic dream of Sebastianism, the hope for a miraculous return, had faded into a folk memory, replaced by a more pragmatic and dangerous sentiment: resentment. By 1640, that resentment had reached its breaking point. The Spanish Empire, the great global superpower of the previous century, was now creaking under the strain of 100 years of constant warfare. It was fighting a ruinous multi-front war in Germany, the 30 Years' War, a seemingly endless conflict with France. And now, it faced a massive internal revolt in its own province of Catalonia. The Spanish chief minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, in a desperate attempt to shore up his crumbling state, made a fatal error. He tried to centralize power, to erase the old autonomies, and to force the Portuguese nobility to contribute troops and taxes to crush the Catalan rebellion. For the proud aristocracy of Portugal, being asked to shed their blood to preserve the integrity of Spain was the final insult. In the quiet, shadowed halls of their Lisbon palaces, a group of nobles, who would become known to history as the 40 Conspirators, began to plot. Their plan was audacious: a swift, decisive palace coup to overthrow the Spanish administration and place a native Portuguese nobleman on the throne. Their chosen candidate was the wealthiest and most powerful aristocrat in the kingdom, a quiet, cautious, and music-loving man who was the Duke of Braganza. The Duke, whose name was John, was initially hesitant. He had much to lose, but the conspirators and his own ambitious wife convinced him that the moment to reclaim Portugal's destiny had arrived. On the morning of the 1st of December, 1640, the conspirators put their plan into motion. They stormed the royal palace in Lisbon's main square, the Terreiro do Pacho. They cornered the hated Secretary of State, Miguel de Vasconcelos, a Portuguese official seen as a collaborator with the Spanish, and threw his body from a window to the cheering crowds below. They forced the Spanish regent, the Duchess of Mantua, to surrender. The Spanish garrison was small and caught completely by surprise. The Lisbon coup was a stunning, almost bloodless success. The Duke of Braganza was proclaimed King John IV, and the news spread like wildfire, sparking popular uprisings in support of independence across the kingdom. But seizing the palace in Lisbon was one thing. Securing the independence of a nation was quite another. Spain, though weakened and distracted, was still a formidable military power, and King Philip IV was not about to let one of his richest kingdoms simply walk away. Thus began the Portuguese Restoration War, a grueling 28-year-long struggle for survival. It was not a war of grand, sweeping campaigns, but a slow, attritional conflict of border raids, scorched earth, and long, wearying sieges of fortified towns along the frontier between the two nations. This raises a crucial historical question. How did tiny, impoverished Portugal, with a population of barely 1 million, manage to hold off and ultimately defeat the might of the Spanish Empire? The answer lies less on the battlefields of Portugal and more in the wider context of European politics. Portugal survived because its enemy was fighting a world war and bleeding from a dozen other wounds. King John IV, the reluctant duke, proved to be a masterful diplomat. He immediately dispatched envoys to Spain's enemies, seeking allies in his struggle. He found a willing partner in Cardinal Richelieu of France, who was delighted to support and finance a new front that would further drain Spanish resources. John IV also worked to re-establish Portugal's oldest diplomatic relationship, the alliance with England. This would culminate in the marriage of his daughter, Catherine of Braganza, to King Charles II of England, a union that brought the English into the war on Portugal's side and came with a famous dowry, the port of Tangier in Morocco, and the obscure trading post of Bombay in India. While Portuguese soldiers fought bravely on the border, their independence was largely secured by the diplomats in Paris and London, who ensured that Spain could never bring its full might to bear upon them. The war for restoration was also fought in the empire. In Brazil, the Portuguese colonists, acting largely on their own initiative, launched their own rebellion against the Dutch, who had occupied the prosperous northeastern coast. For years, they waged a bitter guerrilla war in the sugar fields and mangrove swamps, a struggle fueled by a potent mixture of local patriotism and Catholic resentment against the Protestant Dutch occupiers. This colonial uprising culminated in 1654 with the final surrender of the Dutch at Recife. The reconquest of Brazil was a massive victory, a huge boost to the morale and the treasury of the newly independent nation. In Asia, however, the story was different. The fight against the Dutch continued, but the new Braganza dynasty was too poor and too focused on the war in Europe to be able to reverse the catastrophic losses of the previous decades. The Asian Empire was gone, and it was not coming back. Finally, in 1668, after a series of decisive Portuguese victories on the battlefield, and with Spain exhausted and utterly defeated in its other European conflicts, Madrid conceded. The Treaty of Lisbon was signed, and Spain formally recognized the sovereignty of Portugal and the legitimacy of the House of Braganza. The 60-year captivity was over. Portugal was free. But the nation and the empire that emerged from the ordeal were profoundly changed. The old globe-spanning empire, with its twin hearts in Lisbon and Goa, was a memory. The spice monopoly was lost forever. What remained was a mid-sized European power, an independent kingdom whose imperial focus had now shifted almost entirely westward, across the Atlantic. The palace was no longer divided. A Portuguese king once again sat on the throne, but his gaze, and the gaze of his entire nation, now looked not to the fading riches of the East, but to the vast, lucrative, and ever more central prize of Brazil. Section 19. Portugal, having reclaimed its independence, found itself in a sober new world. The hard-won freedom of 1668 did not restore the glories of the past. The Asian spice monopoly was a memory, shattered by the corporate efficiency of the Dutch. The Brazilian sugar economy, while still profitable, was facing stiff new competition from British, French, and Dutch plantations in the Caribbean, causing prices to fall and profits to shrink. The nation was free, but it was diminished, a second-tier power clinging to its vast Atlantic colony, haunted by the memory of its former greatness. The crown was in desperate need of a new source of wealth, a miracle that could restore the kingdom's fortunes. And that miracle, when it came, did not arrive on the sails of a carrack from the east, but was found glinting in the bottom of a stream, deep in the unknown heart of Brazil. The men who found it were not royal explorers or noble-born captains. They were a unique and uniquely brutal breed of men, the bandeirantes of São Paulo. For over a century, these rugged, mixed-race frontiersmen had been the masters of the Brazilian interior, the sertão. They were a law unto themselves, a society of pioneers forged in the harshness of the frontier. And their primary business was human trafficking. They organized great, quasi-military expeditions, called bandeiras, that would march for months or even years into the uncharted wilderness. Their goal was to hunt and capture indigenous people, often by launching devastating raids on the Jesuit missions where native communities had gathered, and to march their captives back to the coast to be sold as slaves to the sugar plantations. The traditional history of Brazil paints these men as heroic, leather-clad pioneers who single-handedly expanded the borders of the colony. A more critical view sees them as genocidal slave raiders. The truth, as always, is an uncomfortable fusion of both. They were masters of survival, men of incredible courage and endurance who knew the secrets of the interior. But their explorations were lubricated by shocking violence. And it was in the course of these relentless slave hunts in the early 1690s that they made a discovery that would change the empire forever. While prospecting in a rugged mountainous region hundreds of miles inland from Rio de Janeiro, a land they would name Minas Gerais, the general mines, the bandeirantes began to find gold. At first, it was just flecks and small nuggets in the riverbeds. Alluvial gold washed down from the mountains over millennia. But soon, they uncovered the source, one of the richest gold deposits the world had ever known. News of the discovery spread with explosive speed. triggering a gold rush of epic proportions. It was a human tsunami. Tens of thousands of people from every corner of the empire were seized by gold fever. Wealthy planters from the coast sold their sugar mills and headed for the mountains. Poor peasants and artisans from the villages of northern Portugal emptied their life savings to book passage on the first ship to Brazil. They were all drawn by the dream of instant, fabulous wealth. The remote, unpopulated valleys of Minas Gerais were transformed overnight into a chaotic, violent, and dynamic new society. Boomtowns with names like Ouro Preto, Black Gold, and Mariana sprang up from the mud, their streets a morass of prospectors, merchants, priests, government officials, and a vast, ever-growing population of enslaved Africans who were brought in by the thousands to perform the back-breaking labor of the mines. The Portuguese crown, which had spent decades ignoring the interior, now moved with decisive speed to impose its authority, and more importantly, to claim its share of the incredible wealth. A complex and often brutal administrative system was established to control the gold fields. At the heart of this system was the Quinto Real, the royal fifth, a simple but enormously effective tax of 20% on all gold produced. To enforce the Quinto, the crown decreed that no raw gold dust could be legally circulated. All gold had to be brought to official smelting houses, the Casas de Fundição, where it would be melted down, assayed, stamped with the royal seal, and the crown's 1/5 share deducted before being cast into bars that could be used as currency. This tax would pump a staggering river of gold into the royal treasury in Lisbon for the next 50 years. This sudden, almost unimaginable influx of wealth transformed the mother country. Under the reign of King John V, from 1706 to 1750, Portugal entered a new and extravagant golden age. The king, known as the Portuguese Sun King, became one of the wealthiest monarchs in Europe, and he embarked on a spectacular building spree, determined to make his capital, Lisbon, a rival to the grandeur of Paris or Rome. The symbol of this era, paid for entirely with the gold of Minas Gerais, is the gargantuan palace monastery of Mafra, part royal residence, part Franciscan monastery, and part basilica. This colossal Baroque structure was a public works project on a pharaonic scale, a mountain of limestone and marble that nearly bankrupted the kingdom and took decades to complete. Across the country, churches were redecorated in a new, exuberant style, their interiors coated in so much Brazilian gold leaf, in a style called talha dourada, that they seemed to be literally dripping with wealth. The king endowed libraries, built a magnificent new opera house, and funded the construction of the Aguas Livres aqueduct, a marvel of 18th century engineering that brought fresh water to his capital. This golden age, however, was a glittering but fragile prosperity. The immense wealth from Brazil did little to develop Portugal's own domestic economy. It was easier for the court and the nobility to simply import everything they needed: fine textiles, furniture, and manufactured goods from more industrialized nations like England. The gold flowed into Lisbon, but much of it flowed straight out again to pay for these imported luxuries, fueling the Industrial Revolution in Britain more than it fueled development in Portugal. The empire, which had once been a complex global network, had now become a deceptively simple system. A vast mining camp in Brazil that existed to fund the extravagant lifestyle of a tiny elite in Lisbon. For a time, it seemed as if the river of gold would never end. But the heart of the empire was no longer a palace or a fortress. It was a hole in the ground, thousands of miles away. The river of Brazilian gold had given the Portuguese Empire a second life, a spectacular 18th century encore. Its capital, Lisbon, had been reborn as a Baroque jewel box, a city of gilded churches, a magnificent new opera house, and grand palaces, all built in a spirit of opulent confidence. It was the proud heart of a global enterprise, the head through which all the wealth of the mines of Minas Gerais and the plantations of Bahia flowed. And on the morning of the 1st of November, 1755, that heart was irrevocably shattered. It was All Saints' Day, one of the most sacred dates in the Catholic calendar. The churches, their interiors literally coated in the gold of Brazil, were filled to overflowing with the faithful, the air thick with incense, and the light of 1,000 votive candles. The city was at peace, midway through the solemnity of morning mass. At approximately 9:40 a.m., the earth began to groan. The first tremor was a deep, unsettling shudder, strong enough to make the great bronze bells in the cathedral towers swing and ring out in a chaotic, dissonant clamor. Then the main shockwave hit. For 5 to 7 minutes of almost unimaginable violence, the ground heaved and pitched like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. Modern seismologists estimate the earthquake's magnitude at close to 9.0, one of the most powerful in recorded history. Its epicenter just off the Atlantic coast. To the people of Lisbon, it was the apocalypse. The new, heavy, top-heavy stone buildings, the very symbols of the kingdom's golden age, were the first to go. The great vaulted ceilings of the city's churches, unsupported by modern engineering, collapsed inwards, crushing thousands of worshippers in an instant. The magnificent Royal Ribeira Palace, with its library of 70,000 books and priceless collection of artworks, slid into the river Tagus. The new opera house, inaugurated only 6 months earlier, was flattened. In minutes, the glittering capital was reduced to a mountain of rubble and dust, the screams of the dying trapped beneath the stones. For the terrified survivors who managed to stumble out of the wreckage, the nightmare was only beginning. Many instinctively fled from the collapsing buildings to the perceived safety of the great open waterfront square, the Terreiro do Pacho, the commercial and administrative center of the empire. And it was there that they witnessed the second act of the cataclysm. They watched in horror as the water of the Tagus estuary suddenly and unnaturally receded, exposing the riverbed with wrecked ships and lost cargo lying on the muddy bottom. Then, the water returned. A series of 3 massive tsunami waves, some 40 feet high, roared up the river from the Atlantic. The wall of water smashed into the crowded square, sweeping thousands of people to their deaths and obliterating the port infrastructure. The docks, the warehouses, and the India House, with its priceless, irreplaceable archives containing the records of 3 centuries of Portuguese exploration. The third and final destroyer was fire. The thousands of candles that had been lit for the All Saints' Day services were now scattered among the splintered timbers and dry tapestries of the ruined churches and palaces. Dozens of small fires began to flicker to life across the rubble. Fanned by a strong north wind, they soon coalesced into a single, monstrous firestorm that raged unchecked for nearly a week. The fire consumed what the earthquake and the tsunami had spared. The entire downtown Bahia district was incinerated. The heat was so intense, it was said to have melted church bells. When the smoke finally cleared, Lisbon was a smouldering, corpse-strewn ruin. Out of a population of some 200,000, it is estimated that between 30 and 60,000 people had perished. The king, Joseph I, and his family had survived. They had been attending morning mass at their country palace in the hills of Belém, which was less affected. The king was so profoundly traumatized by the event that he developed a severe, lifelong claustrophobia, refusing ever again to sleep within the stone walls of a building. For the rest of his reign, the royal court lived in a vast and elaborate complex of wooden pavilions and tents erected on the hills of Ajuda, a court living in a permanent state of emergency. But the shock waves of the Lisbon earthquake were not merely seismic, they were intellectual. The news of the disaster spread across Europe, and it struck the philosophical heart of the Age of Enlightenment. For decades, the prevailing mood among thinkers was one of rational optimism, a belief articulated by the philosopher Leibniz that the world created by a benevolent God was the best of all possible worlds. The Lisbon earthquake was a brutal, terrifying counterargument. How could a good and all-powerful God permit such a thing? And why would he choose to unleash his wrath on Lisbon, one of the most pious and devoutly Catholic capitals in Europe, and on All Saints' Day of all days? The old answer, that it was divine punishment for sin, seemed obscenely cruel and arbitrary. The disaster became a catalyst for a profound shift in European thought, a turn away from optimistic deism and towards a more skeptical and ultimately more secular worldview. The great French philosopher Voltaire, enraged by the event, wrote his Poem on the Lisbon disaster and satirized philosophical optimism mercilessly in his masterpiece, Candide. The earthquake did not just shatter the buildings of Lisbon, it shattered the confidence of an entire generation of thinkers. In the smoking ruins of the city, the king was paralyzed by fear. The government had ceased to exist, and the very foundations of faith and reason were shaken. It was a moment of total collapse, a blank slate upon which a new, more modern, and far more ruthless kind of power was about to be built. Into the smoking, corpse-filled void left by the great Lisbon earthquake, a single man stepped forward. While King Joseph Thorge was paralyzed by terror, living in a tent city on the hills, and the old nobility were either dead, grieving, or uselessly debating the theological meaning of the disaster. The King's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, a tall, imposing, and stone-faced diplomat named Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, saw not an apocalypse, but an opportunity. A man of formidable intellect and even more formidable ambition, he was a creature of the Enlightenment, a rationalist with a deep contempt for what he saw as Portugal's backward, priest-ridden, and inefficient society. As others panicked, his response was famously, chillingly pragmatic. To the king's frantic question of what was to be done, he replied simply, "Sire, we must bury the dead and feed the living." In that moment of supreme crisis, with the old order literally in rubble, power shifted to the one man who had a plan. For the next 22 years, he would rule Portugal as its de facto dictator. The man history would come to know as the Marquis of Pombal. His first and most visible triumph was the reconstruction of Lisbon itself. He immediately quashed any romantic notions of rebuilding the city's charming, chaotic, medieval layout. Pombal saw the ruined downtown Bahia district as a blank slate upon which to impose the pure, rationalist principles of the Enlightenment. He commissioned a radical new design, a perfect grid of wide parallel streets and airy open squares. The buildings themselves were a marvel of pragmatic innovation. All new constructions in the Baixa were to be uniform, elegant, four-story neoclassical structures. And inside their stone facades, they hid a revolutionary secret, the Gaiola Pombalina, or Pombaline cage, an internal, flexible wooden framework designed to sway and dissipate the energy of an earthquake. This was the first example of large-scale, seismically resistant construction in the world. The new Lisbon that rose from the ashes was a monument to order, reason, and the power of the centralized state, a city reborn not in the image of God, but in the image of its ruthlessly efficient creator. The rebuilding of the city was a metaphor for Pombal's larger project, the rebuilding of the Portuguese state. Using the emergency powers granted to him by the terrified king, he began a systematic campaign to crush all rival centers of power and subordinate every aspect of national life to his own will. His two greatest targets were the two institutions that had dominated Portuguese society for centuries, the high nobility and the Jesuit order. The Jesuits, with their vast wealth, their control over education, and their international allegiance to the Pope in Rome, were, in Pombal's eyes, a dangerous state within a state. He saw them as a barrier to modernization and secular control. In 1759, using a flimsy pretext of their involvement in an assassination attempt on the king, he did the unthinkable. He summarily abolished the Jesuit order in Portugal and its entire empire, arrested its leaders, and expelled thousands of its members, seizing all of their schools, missions, and immense properties for the crown. A year earlier, he had dealt with the old nobility with even more spectacular brutality. The so-called Tavora affair began with the same bungled assassination attempt on the king. Pombal, with little concrete evidence, accused several of the most powerful and ancient noble families in the kingdom, the Tavoras and the Averos, of masterminding the plot. After a swift and terrifying show trial, the leaders of the alleged conspiracy were condemned. Their public execution was a carefully staged spectacle of medieval horror, their bodies broken on the wheel before they were burned, and their ashes scattered into the Tagus. The message was unmistakable. The independent feudal power of the old aristocracy was over. From now on, they would be subservient courtiers, their lives and fortunes dependent on the will of the state, a state that was now personified by Pombal himself. With his enemies broken and his power absolute, Pombal unleashed a torrent of reforms designed to drag the empire into the modern world. He sought to rationalize the economy, establishing state-sponsored monopoly companies to manage the trade with Brazil, and to challenge the dominance of British merchants over the Portuguese economy. He moved the capital of colonial Brazil from Salvador to Rio de Janeiro in 1763, a strategic decision to place the seat of power closer to the gold and diamond mines of the South. He completely overhauled the educational system, seizing it from the church and placing it under state control, founding a royal college for the nobility, and radically modernizing the curriculum at the ancient University of Coimbra to focus on science and mathematics. He abolished the legal distinctions between old and new Christians, ending centuries of discrimination against the descendants of converted Jews. He even abolished slavery, but only within the borders of mainland Portugal. The institution would remain the bedrock of the Brazilian economy, which was far too valuable to reform. This is the great debate that still surrounds Pombal. Was he an enlightened modernizer or a brutal tyrant? The truth is that he was both. He was a true enlightened despot, a man who used the absolute tyrannical methods of the old world to impose the rational, centralizing ideals of the new. He ruled by fear, spied on his own people, and filled his prisons with political opponents. But he also rebuilt a capital, shattered the chains of feudalism and religious obscurantism, and single-handedly forged a modern secular Portuguese state. He found an empire in ruins, both literally and figuratively, and he left it rebuilt, streamlined, and forever changed by the force of his singular iron will. The iron fist of the Marquis of Pombal had forged a new, more modern, and more authoritarian Portuguese state. But even his formidable will could not insulate the small kingdom from the great ideological and military storms that were gathering in Europe. The French Revolution and the subsequent rise of Napoleon Bonaparte shattered the old order of the continent, and Portugal soon found itself in an impossible position, trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea. The devil was Napoleon, the undisputed master of the land, who had conquered or subjugated nearly every nation from the Iberian Peninsula to the plains of Poland. The deep blue sea was Great Britain, the undisputed master of the oceans, and Portugal's oldest and most vital ally. Portugal's survival had for centuries depended on the naval protection and commercial partnership of the British. Now, Napoleon, in his effort to wage economic war against his island nemesis, demanded that Portugal join his continental system, a Europe-wide blockade designed to bankrupt Britain by closing every port to its ships. The ultimatum placed the Prince Regent, Dom João, in a terrifying bind. He was ruling in place of his mother, Queen Maria I, who had descended into a tragic madness. He was a mild, intelligent, and famously indecisive man, ill-suited to such a monumental crisis. If he obeyed Napoleon and broke the ancient alliance with Britain, the Royal Navy would surely blockade Portugal's ports, severing the vital link to Brazil and strangling the empire. The entire state would collapse. If he defied Napoleon, a French army would inevitably march across Spain and conquer his kingdom. For months, Dom João played for time, engaging in a desperate, two-faced diplomacy, promising obedience to the French while secretly plotting with the British. But in late 1807, Napoleon's patience ran out. A formidable French army under General Junot crossed the Spanish border and began a rapid, grueling march on Lisbon. With the French just days away, Dom João, the hesitant prince, made a decision of breathtaking audacity, a strategic gambit so strange and so unprecedented that it is still debated by historians. Was it a panicked, cowardly flight, an abdication of his duty to defend his capital? Or was it a masterstroke of geopolitical genius? For decades, Portuguese thinkers had floated a contingency plan. If the mother country were ever existentially threatened, the monarchy could be preserved by relocating the head of the empire to its largest and wealthiest part, Brazil. Now, Dom João put this radical theory into practice. He decided that the Portuguese state would not surrender. It would not be captured and turned into a puppet government. It would evacuate. The entire court, the machinery of government, the royal treasury, the kingdom itself, would decamp to Rio de Janeiro. The days that followed were a scene of organized chaos. The docks of Lisbon were swamped as some 15,000 people, The entire royal family, the nobility, ministers of state, judges, high-ranking clergy, and their households scrambled to board a vast fleet of Portuguese naval vessels and merchant ships. They brought everything they could carry: the royal treasury, the priceless crown jewels, the national archives, and the entire 60,000-volume royal library were frantically crated up and loaded into the holds. On the 29th of November, 1807, with the crucial protection of a British naval escort, the Great Fleet, nearly 50 ships in all, lifted anchor and sailed out of the Tagus estuary. As they cleared the river mouth, the advance guard of Junot's army, ragged, starving, and exhausted from their forced march, appeared on the hills overlooking the city. They had captured Lisbon, but the prize they had been sent to seize, the king and the legitimate government of Portugal, had vanished over the horizon. The 2-month voyage across the Atlantic was a miserable ordeal. The ships were desperately overcrowded and battered by storms. When the fleet finally made landfall in Salvador, the old capital of Brazil, in January 1808, the royal court was a pathetic sight. But their arrival initiated a seismic shift in the structure of the empire. In an instant, the traditional colonial relationship was turned on its head. The colony had become the center of power, the metropole. The tail was now wagging the dog. One of Dom Juan's first acts on Brazilian soil was to sign a royal charter opening the colony's ports to trade with all friendly nations. In practice, this meant Great Britain. This single decree shattered the 300-year-old mercantilist system, the colonial pact, which had dictated that Brazil could trade only with Portugal. It was a de facto declaration of economic independence, a move that delighted Brazilian merchants and their new British partners. After a brief stay in Salvador, the court continued south to Rio de Janeiro, which was now to be the official capital of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. The transformation of the city was immediate and profound. Rio, a sleepy and somewhat provincial colonial outpost, was suddenly expected to function as the administrative heart of a global empire. The Prince Regent ordered the creation of a royal press, a national bank, a naval academy, medical and law schools, and a magnificent botanical garden. The 60,000 books from the Lisbon Library became the core of Brazil's new national library. European architects, artists, and scientists were invited to the city, transforming its culture. For 13 years, a European monarch would rule his empire from a capital in the New World. This bizarre, unprecedented inversion of empire gave Brazil a taste of being the center of its own world. The colonists were no longer governed by decrees from a distant and often ignorant court in Lisbon, but by a king who walked among them. The runaway court had brilliantly succeeded in preserving the Braganza crown from Napoleon's grasp, but in doing so, it had elevated the status and consciousness of its colony to a point from which there could be no return. The seeds of an independent Brazil were not planted by revolutionaries. They were planted by the king himself the moment he stepped ashore in Rio de Janeiro. The departure of Napoleon's armies from Portugal did not bring a return to the old certainties. It left behind a kingdom in a state of profound confusion and a political vacuum. The mother country was devastated by years of brutal warfare, its economy in tatters, and its king, Dom Juan VI, who had been Prince Regent during the flight, was still living in the sun-drenched, tropical splendor of Rio de Janeiro. He had grown comfortable in his new capital and showed absolutely no inclination to return to his impoverished and war-torn European kingdom. For the first time in history, a European colony was ruling its mother country. The situation was surreal, unsustainable, and deeply humiliating for the Portuguese, who felt they had been abandoned, left to become a mere appendage of their own overgrown child, Brazil. This simmering resentment finally boiled over in 1820 with the outbreak of the Liberal Revolution in the city of Porto. Inspired by the new constitutional ideals sweeping across Europe, Portuguese military officers and merchants demanded an end to what they saw as an absolute monarchy, ruling by remote control from the tropics. They formed a revolutionary parliament, the Cortes, and issued two non-negotiable demands: the immediate return of the king to Lisbon and the creation of a written constitution that would limit his powers. King João VI, a man who preferred peace and quiet above all else, was once again caught in an impossible position. He knew that if he refused the Cortes, he would almost certainly be deposed in Portugal. So, in 1821, after 13 years in Brazil, he reluctantly sailed back to Lisbon to swear allegiance to the new constitution, leaving his dashing, impulsive, and ambitious son, Dom Pedro, to rule Brazil as Prince Regent. As he departed, the old king is said to have given his son a piece of shrewd, cynical, and prophetic advice. "Pedro," he whispered, "if Brazil is to break away from Portugal, let it be with you at its head, who will respect me, rather than with one of these adventurers." The king understood what the hot-headed politicians in Lisbon did not. The inversion of the empire had fundamentally and irrevocably changed Brazil. The genie of self-governance could not be put back in the bottle. The new liberal Cortes in Lisbon, however, was blind to this new reality. Composed largely of men who resented Brazil's newfound power and prosperity, they were not just liberals, they were also deeply conservative imperialists. Their primary goal was to turn back the clock, to dismantle the institutions João had created in Rio, and to force Brazil back into its old subservient colonial status. They passed a series of decrees aimed at recolonizing Brazil. They ordered the disarming of Brazilian troops, placed the provincial governments directly under the control of Lisbon, and sought to reimpose the old mercantilist trade restrictions. For the Brazilian elites, the wealthy planters, merchants, and bureaucrats who had thrived during the court's residency, this was an intolerable betrayal. They had tasted economic freedom and political importance, and they would not give it up without a fight. The final fatal insult came when the Cortes formally ordered Prince Pedro himself to abandon Brazil and return to Portugal, ostensibly to complete his political education. This is where the character of Dom Pedro, one of the most debated figures in Brazilian history, takes center stage. Was he a genuine liberal, a heroic founding father who believed in the cause of Brazilian liberty? Or was he simply an arrogant and power-hungry prince who cleverly co-opted a popular movement to satisfy his own ambition, ensuring that an independent Brazil would be a monarchy ruled by him rather than a dangerous republic? He was, in truth, a contradictory mix of both, raised in the absolutist traditions of his family, but fascinated by the liberal ideas of his time. He was a charismatic, headstrong young man who found himself in the perfect place at the perfect time. The Brazilian elites, desperate for a legitimate figurehead to lead their cause and to ensure an orderly transition, that would not threaten their own social and economic standing, which was built on slavery, began to rally around him. They saw in the Prince Regent their best hope for preserving their autonomy against the reactionary decrees of the Cortes. The great turning point came on the 9th of January, 1822. In response to the Cortes' formal demand for his return, Brazilian patriots presented Pedro with a petition signed by thousands, begging him to defy Lisbon and remain in Brazil. In a masterful piece of political theater, he appeared on the balcony of his palace in Rio and uttered the simple, declarative words that marked the point of no return. If it is for the good of all and the general happiness of the nation, I am ready. Tell the people that I am staying. This day is remembered in Brazil as the Dia do Fico, the I am staying day. It was a declaration of defiance, and events moved swiftly towards their inevitable conclusion. The final break occurred 8 months later. On the 7th of September, 1822, while traveling near the Ipiranga River outside São Paulo, Pedro received a new batch of dispatches from Lisbon that effectively stripped him of all remaining authority and treated him like a mere subordinate. In a famous theatrical fit of rage, he ripped the blue and white Portuguese insignia from his uniform, drew his sword, and shouted the immortal words that would become the motto of the new nation: Independencia ou morte. Independence or death. The cry of Ipiranga was the declaration of independence. What followed was less a revolutionary war and more a political tidying up. A brief and scattered conflict was fought to expel the Portuguese garrisons that remained loyal to the Cortes. But the political separation was remarkably swift and relatively bloodless. In December of that year, the Prince Regent was acclaimed as Pedro Thus, the first constitutional emperor of Brazil. The dream of the Lisbon Cortes was in ruins. Not only had they failed to recolonize Brazil, but their aggressive policies had actively driven it to a total formal separation. Portugal, after a few years of refusing to accept the inevitable, was forced to recognize the independence of its former colony in 1825. The great Luso-Brazilian Empire, the creation of centuries, was no more. The vast, wealthy, and dynamic heart of the Portuguese world had now become its own nation, leaving the old mother country a diminished and impoverished kingdom on the edge of Europe, forced to turn its weary gaze to its last remaining imperial possessions, its ancient, neglected, and now suddenly vital territories in Africa. The loss of Brazil was a phantom limb, an ache in the very soul of the Portuguese nation. The great engine of the empire for the past 2 centuries had been uncoupled, leaving behind a small, politically unstable European kingdom with a collection of antique and largely neglected possessions in Africa and Asia. For much of the 19th century, these African territories, Angola on the Atlantic and Mozambique on the Indian Ocean, were little more than coastal trading enclaves and penal colonies. Their primary grim purpose had been as feeding ports for the now abolished, though still illegally practiced, slave trade. The vast interiors of these colonies were a mystery, a blank space on the map controlled by powerful African kingdoms, and the Portuguese presence was often limited to a few crumbling stone forts on the coast and along the lower reaches of the great rivers. The Third Empire, as historians would call this new African phase, was an empire in name only, a relic of past glories. But in the final decades of the 19th century, the European attitude toward Africa shifted with a sudden and rapacious energy. The Industrial Revolution had created a voracious appetite for raw materials, rubber, cotton, palm oil, and minerals. Advances in medicine, like the use of quinine to combat malaria, and in technology, like the steamship and the Maxim gun, suddenly made the conquest and exploitation of the African interior feasible. A frantic, competitive scramble for Africa erupted. A geopolitical feeding frenzy as the great powers of Europe rushed to carve up the continent and claim its resources. For Portugal, this new era presented both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was that their ancient, tenuous historical claims to Angola and Mozambique would be swept aside by more powerful industrial nations. The opportunity was to revive their dormant imperial pride, to prove that Portugal was still a major player on the world stage by creating a new, grand African empire. From this mix of fear and ambition, a great national dream was born. It was a vision of a unified, coast-to-coast Portuguese colony, a single, contiguous belt of territory stretching across the breadth of southern Africa, linking Angola in the west to Mozambique in the east. This grand design became known as the Mapa Cor-de-Rosa, the pink map, from the color used to shade the claimed territory on the maps presented in Lisbon and at international conferences. The pink map became an object of intense nationalistic fervor, a symbol of Portugal's historic rights and future destiny. It was to be the glorious third act in the nation's imperial story. To make this dream a reality, Portugal threw itself into the work of exploration and occupation, sending out explorers like Serpa Pinto and Hermenegildo Capello on epic, death-defying journeys across the continent to sign treaties with local chiefs and plant the Portuguese flag in the vast wilderness that lay between their two coastal possessions. The rules of this new imperial game had been formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, a grim boardroom meeting where the European powers, without a single African present, drew lines on a map and partitioned a continent. The conference established the crucial principle of effective occupation. Historical claims were no longer enough. To have its sovereignty recognized, a nation had to demonstrate a real presence on the ground, troops, administrators, or significant commercial activity. This principle put the onus on Portugal to turn its pink map from a cartographic dream into an administrative reality. But there was one very large and very powerful obstacle in their path. The Portuguese dream of a trans-African empire clashed directly with the even grander imperial dream of Great Britain. Specifically, it conflicted with the vision of the arch-imperialist, diamond magnate, and Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes dreamed of a Cape to Cairo railway, a continuous, unbroken line of British territory running the entire length of the continent, from south to north. The land that the Portuguese claimed in their pink map, the territory of modern-day Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, was precisely the land that Rhodes needed to link British South Africa with the new British possessions in Central and East Africa. Two great imperial dreams were on a collision course, and one of them belonged to a faded 15th century power, while the other belonged to the undisputed industrial and naval superpower of the 19th century. The crisis came to a head in 1889. A Portuguese expedition, led by the explorer Serpa Pinto, entered the Shire Highlands in what is now Malawi, a region of British missionary activity and a key part of Rhodes's northward path. Pinto clashed with local tribes allied with the British and declared the area Portuguese territory. For London, this was the final provocation. Rhodes and his powerful allies in Parliament demanded action. In January of 1890, the British government of Lord Salisbury, a man with little patience for the historical pretensions of weaker nations, delivered an ultimatum to the government in Lisbon. The document was stark, simple, and brutal. It demanded the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all Portuguese forces from the disputed territories. There was no room for negotiation. The implicit threat was clear. If Portugal did not comply, the British Royal Navy would blockade Lisbon and destroy what was left of the Portuguese Empire. For Portugal, it was a moment of absolute national humiliation. Faced with the certainty of a catastrophic war they could not possibly win, King Carlos I and his government had no choice but to submit. They bowed to British demands. The news of the capitulation was met with a firestorm of popular fury in Portugal. Riots erupted in Lisbon and Porto. The public saw the ultimatum and the government's meek acceptance of it as the ultimate betrayal, a devastating blow to the national honor. The monarchy, already fragile, was irrevocably damaged, seen as weak and subservient to foreign interests. The dream of the pink map, the great hope for a revived imperial destiny, was dead, torn up by a single diplomatic note from London. Portugal would go on to consolidate its control over the territories it was left with, Angola and Mozambique. But the grand coast-to-coast vision was gone. The 1890 ultimatum was a brutal lesson in the new realities of power. In the ruthless world of the late 19th century, ancient claims and historical glories counted for nothing against the cold, hard calculus of industrial might and naval guns. The humiliating sting of the British ultimatum did more than just tear up a map. It wounded the national soul, contributing to a growing sense of disillusionment that would ultimately topple the monarchy itself in 1910. Through the chaotic early decades of the 20th century, as Portugal experimented with a volatile republican government, its focus remained fixed on its last great imperial project, the consolidation of its African possessions. The age of coastal forts and tentative inland trade gave way to an era of conquest and administration. Through a series of brutal pacification campaigns, the Portuguese military slowly and violently subdued the powerful inland kingdoms of Angola and Mozambique, imposing a centralized administration and a system of forced labor that was often slavery in all but name. The Third Empire was being built not on dreams of coast-to-coast glory, but on the grim realities of colonial occupation. This new imperial reality was cemented and given a strange mystical ideology by the man who would come to dominate Portugal for nearly half a century, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Rising to power in the 1930s, Salazar established the Estado Novo, the new state, a deeply conservative, Catholic, and authoritarian regime that would keep Portugal frozen in time while the rest of Europe modernized around it. For Salazar, the empire was not a colonial possession. It was the very essence of the nation. He decreed that Angola, Mozambique, and the other territories were not colonies at all, but overseas provinces, integral and indivisible parts of a single multi-continental Portugal that stretched from the Minho River to the island of Timor. This was a direct, defiant rejection of the great wave of decolonization that began to sweep the globe after the Second World War. As Britain, France, and Belgium began to grant independence to their colonies, Salazar's Portugal stubbornly insisted that its empire was eternal and non-negotiable. To justify this increasingly anachronistic position on the world stage, the regime embraced and promoted a powerful sociological myth known as Luso-tropicalism. Developed by the Brazilian sociologist Gilberto Freire, this theory argued that the Portuguese were a uniquely adaptable and humane type of colonizer. Supposedly, their history and climate had made them more tolerant of the tropics and more inclined to mix with and assimilate native peoples, creating a unique multiracial civilization free from the rigid racism that characterized the Anglo-Saxon empires. It was a comforting and seductive idea, a narrative that painted the empire as a benevolent family of nations, and it became the official propaganda of the state. The reality on the ground, however, was one of systematic exploitation and racial hierarchy. And in the early 1960s, this carefully constructed myth was shattered by the sound of gunfire. Inspired by independence movements across Africa, nationalist guerrilla armies rose up simultaneously in three of Portugal's overseas provinces: Angola, Portuguese Guinea, and Mozambique. Thus began the final tragic and ruinous chapter of the empire, the colonial war. For 13 long years, the small, impoverished nation of Portugal fought three simultaneous, unwinnable counterinsurgency wars on a continent thousands of miles from home. The conflict consumed the country. A huge portion of the national budget was diverted to the military. An entire generation of young Portuguese men was subjected to compulsory military service, conscripted to fight and die in the jungles and savannas of Africa for a cause that seemed increasingly pointless and anachronistic. The wars were a slow, bleeding ulcer, draining the nation of its youth, its treasure, and its morale, all while earning it the condemnation of the international community as the last stubborn colonial holdout. The end came not from the battlefields in Africa, but from the barracks in Portugal. The very instrument of the state's colonial policy, the army, would be the agent of its demise. The junior officers, the captains of April, who had borne the brunt of the fighting, grew tired of the endless, senseless conflict. On the morning of the 25th of April, 1974, they launched a military coup in Lisbon. It was one of the most remarkable revolutions in modern history. It was swift, decisive, and almost entirely bloodless. As the tanks rolled through the streets of Lisbon, they were met not with resistance, but with joyous crowds who flooded the streets to celebrate the end of 48 years of dictatorship. A woman working at a flower stall began placing red carnations into the muzzles of the soldiers' rifles, a gesture that was repeated across the city and gave the revolution its beautiful, peaceful name, the Carnation Revolution. The new democratic government's first priority was to end the wars. Decolonization, which Salazar had resisted for so long, now happened with breathtaking and often catastrophic speed. Within a year, in 1975, all of the African colonies were granted independence. The process was a chaotic scramble, leaving a power vacuum that, in Angola and Mozambique, quickly descended into devastating, decades-long civil wars, fueled by the proxy rivalries of the Cold War. 1 million Portuguese settlers, the retornados, were forced to flee these newly independent nations, arriving in a Portugal that was itself in the midst of revolutionary turmoil and ill-prepared to absorb them. The last rites of the empire were performed in the quiet handover of its final, most ancient possessions. The tiny outpost of Macau, the precarious window into China, secured 4 centuries earlier, was peacefully returned to Chinese sovereignty in 1999, the final flag lowered in a quiet ceremony. And so the vast 600-year story comes to a gentle close. It began with a reclusive prince on a lonely cliff, dreaming of what lay beyond the horizon. It grew into a globe-spanning network of fortresses and sea lanes, a tale of caravels and cannons, of spices and sugar, of gold and of slaves. It was an epic of almost unimaginable courage and discovery, and of almost unimaginable cruelty and greed. It was the first of the great European global empires, and the very last to let go. All that is left now is a legacy of language, of architecture, and of a shared, complicated history that binds the peoples of 4 continents. And for Portugal itself, a small country on the edge of Europe, looking out at the Atlantic, there is the quiet presence of saudade, that unique, untranslatable sense of longing for a greatness that has now, finally and forever, passed into the soft and gentle realm of a bedtime story.